Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I pulled my rig into the gravel lot just past first light, hoping the grain facility would have the bins open by 6 a.m. The sky was a pale gray, low clouds pressing down with just a sliver of pink along the eastern horizon. I killed the diesel, opened the door, and took a deep breath of crisp morning air. I'd been on the road since midnight, hauling corn from Nebraska to Kansas, rerouted here on short notice. The place was silent. No shouts, no machinery, just the hiss of my idle engine settling down. I grabbed my logbook and flashlight and walked toward the tallest structure, the old concrete silo they used for oats. It looked like 3 cylinders bolted together, maybe 40 feet high, but there was no visible ladder or stairwell on the outside. I'd driven past this joint dozens of times and never seen anyone climb up there. As I neared the base, something caught my eye. On top of the central silo, 3 dark shapes stood motionless against the lightning sky. At first, I thought they were weather instruments or some rusted hatch covers, but they were shaped like humans. Shoulders, heads, even the way they leaned slightly forward. I clicked on my flashlight and trained it upward. The beam washed over the figures, but they didn't move. No response to my light, no shift in stance. They looked solid, like people in work coveralls, but there was no water tank, no ladder, no catwalk leading up there. Just a blank wall of concrete. My heart kicked up at that. I'm a trucker, seen weird things on back roads, but this was different. I'd have noticed a staircase. I crossed to the front of the silo, looking for any access points. Welded steel ladders, corroded rungs, service hatches. Nothing. The concrete wall was smooth and featureless. I clicked off the flashlight and stepped back, squinting at the silhouettes. Dawn had brightened enough that the sky behind them was light, but the silo itself was dark. In that contrast, the shapes stood out like cutouts. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the grain bins. 2 seconds passed. No reply, no foot shuffle, no radio crackle. Just the soft buzz of birch leaves in an unseen breeze. I pulled out my phone, no signal, and found my hat in my jacket pocket. I tossed it toward the silo top. The hat arcs through the air, disappearing above the rim, but I didn't hear it land. I held my breath, waiting for a holler or a clank, but nothing. Just silence again. My palms were sweating. I thought about calling the dispatch, telling them I wasn't going up there. That felt crazy. So I shook my head and started back toward the truck. The doors were locked, so I popped the fob to unlock them and climbed in. I sat for a moment, engine off, staring at the silo. Then I turned on the dash cam in case I needed it later and walked around to hitch my line to the hopper. Even with the grain trucks lined up behind me, I couldn't shake that image of 3 people standing on the roof. By 6:05, no one had shown up. I clicked through the gates, lined up under the fill spout, and cranked the chute. Grain poured into my hopper, and I watched the top of the silo out of my side mirror. The shapes hadn't budged, not even by an inch. The fill job took 20 minutes. My eyes kept drifting over the dash to that reflection in the glass. 3 silhouettes, motionless. My watch said 6:25 when the chute finished. I dropped the tailgate and hit the release switch. As the doors swung up, I leaned forward, expecting to see movement, a wave, a flash of color. Nothing. I eased the trailer away and began rolling out of the lot. About 50 yards from the entrance, I passed a security camera mounted on a pole. I wondered if it had filmed anything. I frowned at it. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker on the monitor's protective hood, like someone had swiped across the lens, but when I slowed to look, it was just a dent in the metal. I moved down the gravel lane toward the main road. The sky was brighter now, sun about to break free. I glanced back over my shoulder, ready to dismiss those shapes as fading shadows. They were gone. The top of the silo looked empty, just flat concrete under the cloudy sky. I rolled to a stop at the chained gate that blocks the driveway, the one I hadn't noticed before. 2 heavy chains looped through the bars, padlocked together. I could have sworn I'd driven in through an open gate at 1 a.m. There was no padlock then, no chain. My heart sank. I got out and walked to the lock, knuckles white around the hardened steel. No trash on the ground, no footprints, nothing indicating human traffic since I'd been here. It was as if someone had walled me in overnight. I stared up at the roof, but there was no one there now. The sky reflected in the windows of my cab was pale blue. I rubbed my eyes and climbed back in. I called the office, saying the silo gate was locked and I couldn't leave. They said they'd send someone out. I sat in the driver's seat, engine off, watching the place until a county deputy arrived. He kicked the chain, it rattled but stayed secure. He had no key, no way to unlock it. I tried the fob again, hitting the release button. Nothing. The deputy told me he'd call his sergeant to see if there was some maintenance order we didn't know about. Meanwhile, the farmers around the corner had lit their first combines, but no one was working this end of the yard. An hour later, another truck arrived, also locked in. Same story. Driver saw the silhouettes, came back to chains. By mid-morning, a service crew showed up with bolt cutters, Jim and Dwight. They cut the chains, but none of them said a word about seeing shapes or shadows. They just unlocked the gate and left. I drove out, hauled the rest of my load, but I couldn't stop thinking about those figures. 3 of them standing in plain view, then vanishing when I looked back. And the chains, how did the locks get there? No sign of anyone climbing up or down. I told the guys at the diner over lunch, but they shrugged it off. Weight of the world playing tricks on you, huh? I didn't drive back out there at night after that. If I'm passing that way on a run, I stick to the highway shoulder, glancing at the yard through the fence. By daylight, it looks like any old grain facility. No sign anything weird ever happened. But those silhouettes, 15 feet up, standing still, never really left my mind. And I always check the padlocks before I drive through any gate. I woke up before first light, pulled on my camo, and grabbed my rifle. It was December 1st, and about 3 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight. I'd been tracking deer through these woods for years, Giles County, Virginia. Quiet morning, temps in the low 20s, a thin overcast sky that promised dull light. I hiked in past dawn, boots crunching on the crust, aiming for a ridge I figured the bucks would bet on. Around 7:15, I found the tracks. 4 prints, 2 sets of hooves, about 20 minutes old. They led down a gentle slope near a stand of pines. Perfect conditions, sharp edges in the snow, no wind. I knelt and studied them. The spacing set a walking pace, not running. Could be 2 deer or 1. Sometimes the front hoofs leave offset marks. Didn't matter, I planned to follow. I tracked them for maybe half a mile, slipping between trees, careful not to step on my own prints. Everything was hushed, no birds calling yet, no wind rustling branches. The woods felt wrapped in a blanket of snow, muffling every sound. I kept glancing around, expecting to see antlers or flash of brown, but only white trunks and gray sky. The prints curved around a fallen oak, then headed toward a clearing. That's when the first odd thing happened. I felt like someone was watching me. Not a rustle or shadow, just a prickling on the back of my neck. I froze, rifle at the ready, scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I let out my breath, turned back to the tracks, and pressed on. I entered a small grove of young maples. The tracks led to the center, then veered slightly as if the deer had paused. I slowly stepped into the clearing, raised my scope. No deer, no rabbit, no fresh spoor of anything but the prints I'd been following. I crouched and examined the snow. The hoof prints ended. Right at the edge of the clearing, 4 perfect depressions, each about 3 inches deep. Then, nothing. No drag marks, no sign they'd dragged a leg or turned. They just stopped. I looked around the perimeter, scanning for blood or scraps or a hole in the ground. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed beyond that point. I stood and circled the edge, rifle at the ready, half expecting to see the deer bound off or a wounded leg sticking out. But the circle was clean. The snow looked uniform. It was like someone had walked out of a swimming pool, leaving no footprints on dry tile. My heart started pounding. 1,000 reasons tumbled through my head, none of them reasonable. A deer doesn't vanish. Instinct told me to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted. I knelt again and ran my gloved fingers around each hoof mark. Corners were sharp, not melted or partially filled. Fresh, same as when I'd first seen them. Then I heard it, a soft crack like a twig underfoot. I snapped up, aiming at the nearby brush. Hello? I called, my voice sounding loud in the still air. No answer. Footsteps behind me, and I spun, dust flying from my boots. But behind the grove was just trees, more snow. No footprints leading in, none leading out. No snap of branches away from me. Nothing. I backed away from the clearing, eyes flicking along the tree line. Every tree looked the same, pale trunks, white background. I realized I didn't know which way was which. My compass said north, but without landmarks, every direction felt wrong. I checked the hoof prints again. Maybe I could retrace my steps, but they were gone. Somehow, the snow around that clearing had erased all my tracks. Panic started to rise. The wind stayed still. That prickling feeling returned, like something was crawling on my skin. I dropped to my knees and rubbed my palms in the snow, trying to get a grip, then stood up fast, shaking. My rifle felt heavy in my hands. I decided to head back by memory, moving along the hoof prints until they stopped, then turning back toward the way I'd entered the grove. After 5 minutes of picking a random line through trees, I found my own footprints again. The relief was instant. I'd circle back to my cabin, no more tracking. I walked fast, boots cutting new lines in the snow, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Every time I stopped to check direction, I felt the same prickling and heard the faint crack of a branch. Yet, no wind, no animals, just that low, tense hum in the silence. Finally, the tree line opened onto a frozen creek that I recognized. I slowed, knelt, and saw my prints leading straight to the bank. I followed the creek downstream, crossed a fallen pine I knew well, and emerged onto the main track, a logging road. The early morning light was dim but steady. I exhaled hard and started the trek back to the truck. When I got home, the sun was higher. I booted off my snow-covered gear on the porch, brushed snow off my jacket, and went inside. Jenna, my wife, was up and making coffee. She smiled when she saw me. Cold morning? Just cold, I said, forcing a smile. I hung up my coat and wiped my boots. Later, I looked at my hunting journal. I'd sketched the hoof prints, noting how they ended, and written a few lines. Tracks stopped mid-step, no sign in the snow, felt watched. I stared at that entry, thinking I'd misremembered or hallucinated, but the description felt as odd as I'd lived it. Over the next week, that grove bugged me. I went back, maybe half a mile off the road, but I could never find it again. Trees blend together in winter woods, but I even tried following the creek in the other direction. Nothing matched, just unbroken snow and familiar pines. I don't hunt there anymore. I pick spots closer to the road where I know I can find my way out. I've told friends about what happened. They shrug, sounds like a story, they say. But I know what I saw, a deer trail that ended, hoof marks frozen in snow, and the sense I wasn't alone. Some mornings I dream I'm back in those woods, following tracks that never reach anything but a cold, empty clearing. My boots echo in the snow, over and over, until I wake up and feel the floor beneath me, the quiet of my bedroom, and the sun just coming through the curtains. I remember leaning my forehead against the cold glass of the back window around 2:15 a.m., trying to keep my eyes open. We were driving north on Highway 47, the stretch that cuts through the Willamette National Forest. Dad was behind the wheel, Mom was dozing in the passenger seat, and I was clutching my bag of pretzels on the bench seat and back. I'd asked to come along. I wanted to see the coast at sunrise. But halfway through Oregon, I was already half asleep. That's when I saw the lights. They weren't headlights. They hung among the trees on our right, zigzagging just beyond the tree line, matching our speed as we cruised at about 50. I sat up straight, blinking. The first two were small, yellow-white glints, shifting side to side in perfect rhythm with the road. Then two more, faint, reddish ones, dropped in behind. They paced us for maybe 3 or 4 miles, always at the edge of the forest, never more than 30 feet off the pavement. I nudged Mom. "Look," I whispered. She mumbled, "Huh?" and turned over. Dad didn't notice, I'm sure of it. He never takes his eyes off the road. I watched those lights drift past every utility pole, each time blinking just as we passed. At first, I thought it was camping lanterns, maybe people hiking along the service road. But there was no service road out there, nothing but trees. And the lights moved too smoothly for someone carrying gear. No bobbing like a flashlight, just a calm, side-to-side drift, easing forward as if they were locked to our wheels. I leaned forward and tapped on the divider behind the front seats. Mom woke up, squinting. What is it? There, I said. Did you see that? The lights in the trees. I pointed out the window. She yawned and said, probably just hunters. Odds are we're near some logging road. They've got spotlights for elk. I watched the lights shift again, exactly when we passed a curve in the road. They didn't cut through the trees to follow us. They just glided along the edge, like they were aware of the asphalt and stayed parallel to it. I wasn't convinced about hunters. By then, the cloud cover had broken enough that I could see a few stars, and there were no distant towers or glow from nearby roads. Just black forest and that string of lights drifting. I tried snapping photos with my phone, but the flash turned the screen white, scaring the lights away for a second. When the trees faded back to darkness, they were gone. I checked the camera roll, only the flash images, nothing beyond the trees. I fumbled with the phone for a moment, trying to get a clean shot, but nothing appeared. The lights seemed to vanish whenever I aimed the camera. I tucked the phone away and sat back, wondering if I'd imagined it. But I'd felt that pull in my chest, a nervous little tug whenever the lights hovered by a big Douglas fir. Every time we passed a tree, they lingered beside it for a beat, then drifted to the next. Mom woke again, this time more alert. "What's up, kiddo?" I told her. "I saw lights back there. Someone's in the woods next to us." She frowned at the window, took a sip of coffee from the thermos she'd packed. "It's a state forest. People hunt and hike at night. They're probably on a trail." "I didn't see a trail," I said, "and they weren't walking." She shrugged and gave me a warning look, like I was being dramatic. Dad said nothing but flicked on the overhead map light, checked his speed. We drove on in silence. About 20 minutes later, the glow of a 24-hour gas station popped up ahead. Dad announced, "Time for fuel." He slowed off the highway onto a dim frontage road. The lights in the trees held their pace until we passed a gap in the forest. No more lights. They never blinked once more. I pressed my face to the glass, looking back down the dark woods. No glow, no lanterns, just black trunks and shadows. At the station, Dad filled the tank and popped the hood to check the oil. Mom went inside for snacks. I stayed in the back seat, door open, only half listening to the humming pumps. An hour ago, I had watched those lights keep pace beside us. Now there was nothing behind the forest line. As Dad shut the hood, I slid out. "They were there," I told him. "They stopped too, when we did." He glanced at me, confused. "Stopped what?" "Those lights. They were following us up the highway. Then when we pulled off, they just stopped." I pointed back toward the dark stand of trees. He shrugged. "No one's out there now, son. Just the usual forest." I didn't argue. Instead, I walked closer to the edge of the station lot, stood by the pumps, and stared at the tree line. The headlights from the station lights reached maybe 10 feet into the woods. After that, it was deep black. I waited. Nothing moved. No spotlights, no hunting lantern beams, only the wind chimes above the store door jingling softly in a non-existent breeze. Mom came out carrying chips and soda. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "Yeah." I stared past her at the dark trees. My stomach felt tight. "They're gone." She set the snacks on the roof of the truck. "Maybe they left." I shook my head. "They were following the car. They stopped when the car stopped." Dad didn't look over. He climbed in, slammed the door for the lock to click. I slid back in the middle. Mom settled beside me. We drove off with the gas station lights behind us. I watched the rearview mirror. The forest slid past empty and silent. That night, I replayed it in my head, lights pacing the car, silent and smooth, then evaporating the moment we stopped. No flash of headlights, no beam lifting into the sky, no last flicker. Just nothing. I tried to get some sleep in the motel, but my mind kept flicking back to the highway and those lights drifting beside us. I wondered if I'd really seen them, or if they were a trick of my half-awake mind, conjured by the swish of tires and the dark line of trees. The next morning, the highway was bright and dry. No fog, no cloud cover. I pressed my face to the early glow against the woods, looking for any sign of light. Nothing. Dad rolled down the window and checked the shoulder. "See? No tracks. No trail." I didn't tell him about the way the lights had moved, how they'd hovered at each tree's edge, or how they never made a sound, not even the hum of a generator or the buzz of LED lamps. I didn't say anything as we rolled into town, passing orchards and empty fields. But when I got home, I told my little sister I'd seen something odd on the trip. She listened with wide eyes, then asked if I thought ghosts could use camping lanterns. I just shrugged. Maybe they could. Maybe they couldn't. Some nights now, when I can't sleep, I think about turning off the porch light and stepping into the yard, looking back at the tree line across the street. I wonder if I'd see lights returning, drifting smooth and silent, same pace as my heartbeat. I walked out of the cabin just before sunrise, the sky a pale slate blue, with low clouds hanging over the pines. Baxter, my mutt, thumped along at my heel, ears perked for squirrels or deer. I'd been doing this trail for years, 2-mile loop through national forest land near Cedar Creek, but that morning felt different. The air was damp, like it had rained overnight, and the usual chorus of birds was strangely muted. We followed the dirt path until it forked near a small brook. Baxter splashed in the shallow water while I wrung out my shirt sleeve and drank from my canteen. That's when I saw it, a break in the trees off to my left, maybe 30 feet from the trail. I'd never noticed a clearing there before. Curious, I crossed the wet ground and pushed through a few branches. The clearing was maybe 20 feet across, ringed by half a dozen mature oaks and maples. Each tree had its bark stripped away in a perfect band from the base up to exactly 6 feet, not 1 inch higher or lower. The exposed wood was smooth and pale, like someone had shaved it clean with a razor. No ragged edges, no splinters or chips on the ground, just tidy, horizontal lines circling every trunk. Baxter sat at the edge of the clearing, hackles slightly raised, staring in. I stepped forward, peering at the nearest oak. I ran my finger along the stripped surface, cool, almost slick to the touch. No tool marks, no grooves, nothing to suggest an axe or saw, just gone. A chill slid down my spine. I glanced back toward the trail. No footprints in the mud, no broken branches, no discarded bark anywhere. I swept my flashlight beam along the forest floor. Fallen leaves lay untouched by bark or boots. Baxter whimpered once. I crouched and put a hand on his collar. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, trying to calm him, though I felt anything but calm. He wouldn't step into the circle, shaking his head as if the ground burned. I reached into my pocket for the phone, but realized there was no signal this far in. I clicked it off. I circled the clearing, measuring in my head, exactly the same height on each tree, exactly level. Someone had to have done it intentionally. But who? And why here? In the middle of nowhere? I called Baxter to me. He padded up to my side and pressed against my leg. I patted his head, heart thudding in my chest. I was about to tell him to follow me back to the trail when I heard something. Soft, like a breeze brushing needles overhead. But the air was still. The fog pressed close around the clearing, muffling sounds. Birds stayed silent. Even the brook's rush sounded distant. I shined my flashlight into the canopy. Through the low clouds, a sliver of light showed waving branches, but nothing moved. No wind. I felt watched. I took one more look at the stripped bark, memorizing the crisp edge. Then I turned and hurried back to the trail, Baxter at my heels. Leaves crunched underfoot, normal sounds returning once I was out of the clearing's hush. The forest seemed relieved, as if that circle had held its breath and let it out when we left. I reached the cabin shaking. My hands fumbled for keys. Inside, I closed the door behind me and leaned back against it, panting. Baxter scratched at the wood, whining. I scooped him into my arms, his fur damp, his eyes wide. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the woods. The fog drifted between trunks, hiding the ground. I wondered if I'd dreamt it, but the chill in my fingers said otherwise. I texted my friend Aaron, who'd done forestry work nearby. Ever heard of bark stripping like that? Perfect bands, no damage around, no tracks. No reply. I turned off the lights and left the window open. My porch light lit the edge of the trail but reached no farther. All day, I avoided the clearing. I kept the curtains closed, checked the locks on the door. Baxter followed me around, sniffing corners, uneasy. I called Ranger Station in town, left a voicemail describing the spot. No one called back by evening. That night, I dreamed of trees bending down to peer through my window. Their trunks were smooth bands of white, stepping toward me on invisible roots. I woke when Baxter whined at the bedroom door and pawed to come in. I let him up, and he climbed onto the bed, turning his head toward the darkness outside. In the morning, I went back, this time with a notebook and a tape measure. Sunrise sliced through the fog, but when I reached the clearing, the light band was gone. The bark had regrown. Not fully, but a thin papery layer covered the wood, scabby and irregular. The 6-foot mark was barely visible, worn by night's condensation. No fresh cuts, no debris. A few tufts of light-colored flake clung to the roots, but they disintegrated when I touched them. I sat on a fallen log, writing down my measurements. Even the leaves looked altered. Edges curled, color paler near the tree line. Baxter sniffed at the ground, nose twitching. He wouldn't step into the center, same as before. I took photos, marking the GPS coordinates, then backed away. The forest returned to normal, birds singing, breeze fluttering. I walked the trail out without looking back. That afternoon, I sorted the pictures at home. The first set from my phone showed dark trunks. The clearing's ring was a solid brown. In the middle, nothing. Then a second batch from the old point-and-shoot in my backpack captured the pale rings. The angle was slightly off, but the cut edges were there, clear and crisp. One photo stood out, a shot of Baxter sniffing at the edge. In the top right corner, where the fog hovered, the image shimmered, a faint, out-of-focus swirl like condensation on the lens. I zoomed in, but it resolved into nothing. No shape, no color. Just a blur that hadn't been visible in the live view. I've been back to that trail twice since. Each time the ground looked normal. No 6-foot rings, no bark fragments, no odd fog patches. Baxter stayed close to me, ears forward, sniffing the branches, but not whining. I keep the photos on my desk. Every so often, I pull up the close-up of Baxter in the clearing, stare at the faint swirl in the sky. I don't know what stripped those trees or why Baxter refused to cross that line. I don't know why the bark seemed to regrow overnight, but I remember the hush of that circle, the way the air bent around it, and how I fled without casting a single fishing line into my own morning calm. It happened in early October, about 6 years ago now. I was solo hiking near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in southern Colorado. I'd planned a 3-day loop starting from the Willow Lake trailhead near Crestone. I was used to hiking alone. I liked the quiet, didn't bring music, didn't even really take pictures. Just me, my pack, and the trail. The weather had been perfect that week. High 60s in the day, down to the low 40s at night. Clear skies, dry. No one else on the trail as far as I could tell. After the first afternoon, I didn't see another person. That was part of the appeal. The third day, I took a detour off the main route to follow this dry creek bed I'd noticed on the topo map. It cut between 2 low ridges and curved back toward the original trail after a few miles, so I figured I'd get some solitude and maybe spot some elk. About an hour in, I found this big, flat rock wall near the edge of the creek bed. Maybe 12 feet high, shaped like a half circle. Looked like an old volcanic formation or something. Black stone, smooth in places, with this strange shimmer to it, like glass under dust. I dropped my pack and leaned against it to rest. Not in direct sun, I was in the shade, but the stone still felt warm. I drank some water, had half a protein bar, just relaxing. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, I felt this intense heat hit the back of my neck. Not like sunburn or warm air, I mean heat, like being way too close to a campfire. It hit hard and fast. I remember jerking forward, thinking maybe a flare-up from the rock or some weird geothermal thing. I turned around immediately, expecting maybe sunlight bouncing off something or a thermal vent, I don't know. But there was nothing. Just dry creek bed, scattered pine needles, a few rocks. No wind, no sun directly above me. Nothing that could have caused that heat. And the sound was wrong. It took me a second to realize it, but the quiet had gotten too quiet. No breeze, no birds, no rustle of trees, not even the usual ringing in my ears. It was like being sealed in a vacuum, just silence, thick and heavy. Then the heat cut off. Not gradually, it was just gone like a switch flipped. My skin still tingled like I'd been near a fire, but the air was cool again. I stood there staring at the spot where I just felt it, trying to make sense of it. That's when I remembered my compass. I kept it clipped to my chest strap, old habit. Pulled it up to check direction so I could orient myself back to the trail. The needle was spinning. Not drifting or bobbing, I mean full speed, smooth spinning, like someone had set a fan under it. I tapped it, still spinning. I held it out at arm's length, no change. I took a few steps away from the rock wall, maybe 30 feet down the creek bed. The needle slowed, then stopped pointing due west. I walked back toward the wall. As I got closer, the needle started twitching again, then went into that same fast spin once I got within about 10 feet. I stepped back. It slowed. I repeated that 3 times. Same thing each time. The spinning started near the wall, and it only happened facing certain directions. I remember standing there thinking maybe there was iron in the rock, some natural magnetism, but I've seen magnetic interference on hikes before. It's usually subtle. This was not subtle, and I hadn't seen anything like that the day before when I passed similar rocks. I backed off and sat on a nearby log to regroup. My phone had no service, no surprise out there, but I pulled up my offline map app to see if maybe there were old mines or something nearby. The GPS dot didn't move. No compass reading, just a blank screen showing my last known location from the day before. I sat for maybe 15 minutes, not sure if I should head back or keep going. Everything just felt off. That's the best word for it. Not dangerous exactly, but like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like the air itself was wrong. It had a hum to it. Not sound, more like a pressure, almost like standing under high voltage lines. Eventually, I decided to move on. I didn't want to camp near that rock. I hiked another couple miles until I hit the main trail again and made camp near a small stream. That night, I had a hard time sleeping. Not from fear exactly, I just kept thinking I was hearing something in the trees. Soft footsteps, always stopping when I sat up. Next morning, I packed up early and made the last 6 miles back to the trailhead in record time. When I got home, I looked up the area around that rock wall. There wasn't much. No known mineral deposits, no mining history. The closest thing I found was some mention of strange compass readings in that part of the Sangres back in the 70s. But it was just a one-line note in a geology forum. I still have the compass, it works fine now. I've tried replicating what happened, brought it to other basalt formations, iron-rich spots, even some active geothermal areas. Never seen it spin like that again. I went back the next summer with a friend, tried to find that creek bed again. We got close, but we never found the exact spot. He thought I'd just gotten turned around or remembered it wrong. Maybe I did. But I know what I felt. That heat, that silence, the spinning needle. I haven't hiked solo since. I was out at the Cypress Marsh around 9 that August evening, camera on a tripod, waiting for the fireflies to come out. I'd driven 2 hours from Baton Rouge after work, hoping to catch some long exposure shots of their patterns dancing above the reeds. The weather was perfect, warm, sticky air, just a hint of breeze off the water. No moon to speak of, just stars and the soft glow from the nearest highway lights, miles away. I set up on a little patch of dry ground where the grasses gave way to a narrow walkway. I'd been there once before, last summer, and it was quiet enough that you could hear frogs croaking under the surface and the occasional splash where a fish broke the water. I arranged my Nikon D750 on a heavy-duty tripod, lens pointed at a clump of tall reeds about 20 yards out. I dialed in manual focus, set ISO to 200, aperture at f2.8, and planned a series of 30-second exposures to trace the fireflies. Everything felt normal, just me, the camera's low hum, and the marsh settling into darkness. After the first few frames, I could see little streaks of light, tiny arcs blinking on and off, sometimes darting straight up, sometimes hovering near the water's edge. I adjusted the framing, moving left a foot so I could include more open water. The second frame came out even better. Little yellow flecks across the frame, random but beautiful. Around the 5th shot, I heard a distant rumble, like an outboard motor far off, but that didn't last more than a few seconds. I checked my watch, 9:42 p.m., and shrugged. Could have been someone fishing. The marsh isn't remote enough to be totally deserted. I set the camera for the next exposure and settled back on my camping stool, sipping from the half-empty bottle of water I always bring. Then, the flash happened. It was like someone flipped on an industrial lamp for a split second. I caught it from the corner of my eye, a sudden white glow covering the reeds, the water, even the sky. So bright that I reflexively shielded my eyes, thinking it might burn retinas. It lasted less than a heartbeat, not enough time for my eyes to refocus. Then everything went back to almost black, as if nothing had happened. I blinked a few times, heart thumping, and looked at my camera's viewfinder, still lined up on the same spot. I quickly checked the exposure counter. Photo 6 of 10. Alright, so it was the sixth shot. I advanced to review it. The display blinked, and there it was. A single frame. Mid-flash. A black oval shape hovering just above the reeds, perfectly centered, stark against the whitened background. No legs, no shadows, just a matte black ellipse about the size of my hand at arm's length. I swiped to the fifth frame. Normal. Fireflies. Dim marsh. No bright wash. I swiped to the seventh frame. Also normal. Stars winking faintly, reeds barely lit, nothing in the sky. The flash of light didn't show in any other frame. It was like it only existed for that one exposure. I sat there for a good minute, staring at the oval floating above the marsh grass. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the camera. I thought it might be a lens flare or sensor artifact, but I'd never seen anything like it. And I definitely saw the flash myself, a real burst of light. I scrolled back to the thumbnails. 6 still showed the black oval, but just that one. The others were untouched. I shut the camera off, careful not to delete anything. I packed the tripod and lens into my backpack, and I started walking back along the trail. I half expected to see the shape in the sky again, but the air was still, not a hint of light. The fireflies were gone. The frogs had quieted. Everything felt muted. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never heard footsteps or anything moving in the reeds beside me. Just the soft squish of my boots in the muddy path. My phone buzzed. No signal, of course, but I resisted the urge to check for messages. The last thing I wanted was to break the spell of that image in my head. At the car, I rummaged in the glove box for a flashlight. My hands were still trembling. I switched it on and shone it out across the marsh. Nothing. No glow, no shape, no echo of that brightness. I snapped the light off and sat inside for a while, engine idling, doors locked. My mind raced. A drone? A hot air balloon? No, none of those explain a single black frame in a sequence where every other shot was normal. And the way it illuminated the entire landscape in a fraction of a second, that was different. Something else. I drove off on the dirt road toward the highway, windows down so I could listen for any hum or drone noise. There wasn't one. Once I hit pavement, I flicked on the radio, tuned into a country station, anything to hear someone else's voice. I watched the lines of trees blur past, tried to make sense of the photograph. In the rearview mirror, the marsh shrank until it was just a memory. When I got home, I downloaded the raw files onto my computer. I opened the 6th file in Lightroom and zoomed in. The oval was perfectly smooth, its edges crisp, despite the rest of the frame being slightly overexposed. No pixels out of place, no glitch artifacts. It was as if a dark hole had briefly occupied the spot and cast its silhouette on the illuminated world behind it. I tried enhancing the contrast, playing with exposure, the background light, bleached out details, but the oval stayed jet black. There wasn't even a hint of reflection or translucence. It absorbed light rather than reflected it. I stared at it late into the night. My roommate Molly knocked on the office door around midnight, asked if I was okay. I lied, said the file transfer was slow. After she left, I went back to the image and tried to convince myself it was a flaw, dust on the sensor, a shutter malfunction. But every piece of the photo that should have shown the defect did not. It was clean, only that oval showed up. I haven't gone back to the marsh since. I've considered it, but something about that place feels changed now, like it remembers the flash. Whenever the nights get still and the sky turns dark, I think about that single black shape hovering over the reeds. And though I've shared the photo with a few friends, none of them can explain it either. None have come with me to see if it'll happen again. I don't think I would go back alone. Not at night, not with a camera. I'm not sure I want to catch it on film a second time. I was having my first cup of coffee out on the back porch when I saw the trees move. It was nearly 5 a.m., late April, and a damp fog had rolled in overnight. I'd woken up early to check on the generator. Spring storms can knock out power, and decided to sit outside for a bit before daybreak. The air was cool, almost chilly, but I didn't notice any breeze. Not a whisper of wind, not a rustle in the underbrush. Then I saw the poplar in the northwest corner tip over, just enough for me to catch it in the corner of my eye. I thought it was my imagination, or maybe an animal brushing against the trunk. But the second poplar swayed, then the birch behind it, and oddest of all, the wild apple near the fence line bent forward, then back, in perfect unison. I set my mug down and leaned forward on the railing. Fog curled around the rail posts, pooling in the yard, but no wind stirred it. I watched the line of trees for a full minute, thinking maybe a deer herd was crashing through undergrowth, but the leaves only quivered, no branches cracked, no deer leapt. I stood up, heart thumping. The generator was a quarter-mile away, down by the road, so there was no moving machinery to kick up a breeze. The fog was holding still, thick enough to dampen sound. I heard my own breathing, and nothing else. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the porch, my boots making soft clicks on the wood. I scanned the yard, empty. Then I walked down the steps and paused at the edge of the grass. The trees were still bending, now reaching almost 10 degrees to the south, then righting themselves, over and over, like a silent wave running through the row. My flashlight beam cut through the fog. All around, the yard was mine alone. Mowed grass, flower beds, the old metal swing set that squeaked only if you pushed it. Tonight it was motionless. Only the trees moved. I took 3 slow steps forward and swept the light across the field beyond. The pasture was half flooded this time of year, reeds and cattails poking out, reflections of the porch light rippling in shallow water. I stayed at the fence line, hands tight in my pockets, my breath fogging out in a little cloud. That's when I saw it, just past the orchard, hovering maybe 40 feet above the ground. A matte black shape against the gray sky, perfectly still. It was squat, like a flattened oval, maybe 30 feet across. No lights, no seams, nothing that looked mechanical, just a silhouette with smooth edges. I swallowed and steadied the flashlight. I clicked it off. Total darkness, but I could still make out the shape. It wasn't glowing, only darker than the fog behind it, like a hole in the mist. I closed my eyes for a second and opened them again. Same spot. I stepped off the grass into the wet soil, boots sinking a bit, and held the beam at waist level. The flashlight caught no detail, just a matte finish that absorbed the beam. No reflection. I called out, "Hello?" but my voice was swallowed by the fog. My own echo, distant. The shape didn't move. The trees continued their silent sway behind me, but this thing was rigid, anchored in place. I felt the hair on my arms rise, and I forced my legs not to shake. My logical brain flickered on, maybe a clump of low cloud hanging there, or a weather balloon caught on currents. But it was too solid looking, too defined, no wisps or drips. I pointed the flashlight down at the grass, then back up. It was still there. I raised my hand and wiped condensation off the beam lens. Still there. I backed up 2 steps, and the shape stayed the same size, the same height. No perspective change. It hung like it was following me, but I didn't feel followed. I felt watched. Then as I looked, it jerked upward. Not climbed or drifted, shot straight up. The world went quiet for a moment, then I heard it. A low hum, like distant machinery warming up, growing louder and lower in pitch as the shape rose. In 2 seconds, it was gone, just a blank curtain of fog and sky where it had been. The trees stopped moving immediately. The wind, or whatever motion had been running through them, cut out. Total stillness. I stood there blinking. The fog thinned a bit in the first light, like showing distant hills, ordinary farm buildings. My flashlight beam swung back to the spot, revealing only branches, dew, damp earth. No scorch marks, no swirling mist, no disturbance beyond a slight indentation in the reeds where I'd stood. I turned and sprinted back to the porch, boots slapping the boards, pulled the door shut, double-checked the deadbolt. Inside, I flicked on every light. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, hallway. The house felt too bright and too small. My heart wouldn't slow. I stared out each window at the yard, expecting to see the shape reappear, but the trees stood motionless, the fog retreating toward the woods. I tried the TV, radio, my phone. No news, no weather alerts, no missed calls. My neighbor's light was off. No chance he'd seen anything. I could still hear the soft hum in my ears, like a tuning fork vibrating somewhere in my skull. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug. Dawn was breaking, pale and pink. The fog bank lifted enough to show stable rows of poplars and birches, the orchard's budding buds, the swing set's chipped paint. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't believe it. Over the next hour, I kept glancing out the windows. At first light, the yard looked peaceful, familiar. Then I saw it. A 5-foot patch of ground beneath where the shape had hovered. Grass flattened flat, reeds bent in a perfect circle around it. Not scorched or burned, just pressed into the mud, like someone had pressed a giant cookie cutter straight down, then lifted it. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and hurried outside to mark it. The circle was roughly 15 feet across, clear outline, no footprints in it. I kicked at the edge with my boot. Soil was damp but not waterlogged, tufts of grass sprouting sideways. No sign of digging. It was exactly level with the rest of the field. I stood there for a long moment, flashlight dangling. The morning air felt different, thinner in my chest. I turned and walked back to the porch, leaving the circle untouched. I didn't tell anyone until much later. I mowed the lawn that afternoon, trimmed branches, dead-headed flowers. Routine work to make the yard look no different than before. At dusk, I sat on the porch again, coffee in hand, rain clouds gathering over the ridge. I watched the wind pick up, hearing the leaves tremble, feeling the world tilt back to normal. But every now and then I think of that black oval slipping upward, of the trees swaying with invisible fingers, of the circle pressed into the grass. And I wonder if next time I step out at dawn, I'll see something hovering just beyond the fence, waiting for the world to still itself again. It was around 2:30 in the morning, middle of July, humid as hell. I was out on a call for the county. Waterline sensors pinged low pressure out near Danford Road, which is just a gravel utility strip running behind the cornfields east of town. Nothing paved out there. Most people don't even know it exists unless they've worked for the Public Works Department or grew up around here. The truck I was driving was one of the older utility rigs, a white 2009 F-250 with a toolbox in the bed and a maintenance rack. Nothing fancy. It rattled a little when you got up past 50, but it did the job. I had a cooler in the passenger seat with a few Gatorades and a flashlight, and my county radio clipped to the dash. It was a moonless night, heavy clouds overhead, not storm clouds, just thick and low. It was so dark my headlights looked like they were shining through milk. No wind. Even the crickets were dead quiet. I got onto the service road around 2:40. There aren't any houses out that way, just flat fields on both sides, soybeans on the left, corn on the right. The gravel road cuts between them for about 2.5 miles before hitting the utility shed and pressure valve station. I've done this drive dozens of times. Nothing ever happens out there. About halfway in, maybe 1.25 miles from the shed, I saw this pale light through the passenger window. At first I figured it was a plane or maybe someone spotlighting deer, but the way it hovered didn't sit right. It was just hanging there, maybe 30-40 feet above the cornfield, totally still. No movement, no flicker. I slowed down and rolled to a stop. The gravel crunched under the tires, and then it was just silence. I leaned across the seat to get a better look, engine still idling. The light wasn't bright, more like the color of a dying halogen bulb, kind of yellow-white with a greenish tint. It didn't cast shadows. That was the part that stuck out. Everything around it stayed dark. The corn beneath it wasn't lit up at all. I sat there for a solid minute, watching it. It didn't move or pulse or anything, just floated there, low and quiet. Then the engine cut out. No sputter, no warning, just dead. The dash lights went black, the radio shut off, and the cab went completely silent. It was instant, like someone yanked the battery cables. I tried turning the key again, nothing, not even the click of the starter. Right then, the county radio crackled back on by itself. But it wasn't dispatch, wasn't even static, really. It was this layered, garbled mess of noise, like someone was speaking into the mic underwater while dragging it across gravel. No words I could make out, just this low, slurred cadence. It kept cutting in and out, and I swear to God there were two voices, not one, both speaking over each other, but not arguing, like they were aligned somehow. The tone was calm, almost rhythmic, but wrong. Totally wrong. I reached up and killed the radio, but it stayed on. The switch did nothing. The speaker just kept murmuring. Outside, the cornfield was dead still, no wind. The light hadn't moved an inch. I got out of the truck, more out of instinct than anything. The gravel under my boots crunched like it was louder than it should have been. I walked around to the front of the vehicle and looked out over the corn. The light was closer now. I didn't see it move, I didn't hear anything, but it had shifted a good 30 feet forward, like it had glided right over the crop. Still low, still not casting a shadow. That's when I noticed there were no bugs, no mosquitoes, no moths bouncing around the beam. That's not normal out here in July. The radio inside the truck was getting louder. Not by much, but enough that I could hear the static speech clearly even from outside. It had this weird, synthetic quality. Not digital, but not human. Hard to explain. It sounded wrong in a way I could feel in my jaw. I don't scare easy, but I could feel the hair standing up on my arms. Not because of anything specific, just the way it all felt off, like the air itself had gone stale. Heavy. I stood there maybe 20 seconds, staring at this thing hovering just above the corn, and then it started rising. Slowly, smooth as glass, straight up. No sound. No shift in light. It went maybe 100 feet up and just blinked out. No fade, no trail. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't, like it had been erased. Everything went silent again. Then the truck's engine coughed back to life all on its own. No key turn. Lights came on, dash lit up, and the radio finally cut off. Just a click, and it was gone. I just stood there for a second, then got back in the cab and sat with the door open. The engine was idling normal, like nothing had happened. I drove the rest of the way to the valve station and did the check. Everything looked fine. Pressure was normal. No leaks, no burst lines. I logged it as a false alarm. On the way back down the same road, I slowed when I passed the same spot. There was no sign of anything. No burn marks, no disturbed corn, no footprints, no tracks. But about 20 feet in, I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The corn in that one area wasn't swaying with the breeze like the rest. It was perfectly still, not broken or bent, just still. The air felt thicker as I drove past it. Back at the garage, I didn't say anything, just filled out the maintenance report and clocked out early. Took the rest of the night off. The truck ran fine the next day. No electrical issues, radio worked like normal. I checked the battery cables myself, nothing was loose. A week later, I drove the same route again, broad daylight, and looked out at that same spot. The corn had grown uneven there. About a dozen stalks were noticeably shorter, stunted, just in that one patch. I didn't mention that either. No one else reported anything. No outages, no sensor trips. The whole thing might as well have never happened. But I know what I saw. It started on a Thursday, a few minutes past midnight. I was spinning vinyl at the console of WCRT, the little college station nobody listened to except the overnight crowd and a handful of insomniacs. My show was called After Hours, but I slapped on whatever freeform jazz I had lying around. It was just me, a pot of bad coffee, and the open phone line. At 12:01 a.m., the first call came in. I hit the on-air button and pressed the handset to my ear. Silence. Then a pattern of clicks, 5 fast, 2 slow, 4 fast, followed by a low beep. Then nothing. I waited a beat longer, but the line was dead. I chalked it up to crossed lines or a prank, punched the red button, and moved on. 10 minutes later, I got another call. Just the dial tone. I thought it was the same number, someone dialing in on accident, so I opened the line, waited through the beep, and there it was again. That click pattern, exactly the same. 5 fast, 2 slow, 4 fast, then a beep. I muted the mic and ran a scan on the board. Nothing on other lines. No incoming digital traffic. No voicemail. The phone system showed only a single momentary connection. No caller ID, no trace. I flipped switches, checked cables, but everything looked normal. At 1:01 a.m. it happened again. By then I was uneasy. The room was dark except for the glow of meters and fluorescent bulbs behind the glass. I played out the segment I'd planned, but I kept looking at the clock, waiting for that minute past. At 1, I queued up another record, spilled some coffee, and dialed the handset again as soon as the top of the hour hit. I tapped my foot through the ring and beep. On the line, click, 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 pause, click, click, pause, click, 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 beep. I hit the air button. Sorry about that, sounds like crossed lines, let's take your song requests. Of course, nothing came through. I played a record, hoping if it was someone wanting a request, they'd try again. But the only thing on the line was that coded rhythm. I started jotting it down on scrap paper. 5 to 2, 4, beep. I didn't know Morse code, so those numbers meant nothing. But I got curious. After my shift ended at 2, instead of heading home, I stuck around to test the lines. I patched the DJ console into an old scanner, switched to line 1, and waited. 3 a.m. Lights flickered overhead when the air conditioner cycled. The console hummed. At 3:01 a.m., there it was, the clicks and beep. I hit record on my phone, then ditched the station and went downstairs to the equipment room, pulling racks off the wall to isolate the signal path. Nothing. The clicks weren't coming through the station's wiring. No crosstalk, no interference. If anything, the lines were silent, dead. Back on air, I played a few slow tracks, notes hanging in the silence, and waited for 4. I hit the phone preamp, boosting to maximum. When the clicks came, they were crisp but tinny, as if broadcast through a cheap speaker underwater. I recorded them again. 5 rapid, 2 slow, 4 rapid, beep, 5 rapid, 2 slow, 4 rapid, beep. By 4:05, I was convinced it wasn't a prankster. Whoever, or whatever, was calling in, they knew exactly when to hit that minute past. And they kept the pattern perfectly consistent, like a metronome. I spent the next week staying late, logging every instance, 12:01, 1:01, 2, 3:01, 4:01, 5:00, up until my shift ended at 6. No calls after that. Day shifts were normal, no clicks at 1:01 or anything, only on my show. The pattern became almost comforting, like a dark ritual. I tried to break it, left the phone off the hook, unplugged the console, played a broken test tone on line 1. But at every minute past the hour, the clicks found their way in. Once I even unplugged the studio entirely and took the line to the control booth down the hall. The clicks followed. No matter how I rerouted, isolated, or grounded, the pattern came through. Then I started hearing them over my headphones in the silence between songs, even when the lines were muted. I'd lean in close to the mic, listening for breathing or voice behind the clicks. There was none, just a precise beat, over and over. One morning, I think it was a Tuesday around 4:01, I tried to record the clicks and slow them down in Audacity. I dropped the speed to half, clean enough to count. The clicks formed a larger pattern, groups of 15, 20, 18, and the beeps cut in every 16 groups. I charted it on graph paper. In Excel, I tried plotting it as coordinates, latitude and longitude, just to see if the numbers matched anything. I pulled up maps of Oregon, Washington, Idaho. Some sets pinged near towns, others were off in the wilderness, in lakes or empty stretches of highway. One match spit out a spot near Starvation Lake in northern Minnesota. Another, a point in the Sierra Nevada up by an abandoned fire watch tower. None of them lined up with anything obvious. I printed them out anyway, folded the pages, and slipped them into my notebook. I didn't tell anyone where the coordinates pointed. I felt exposed thinking about it. At 5:01 a.m., the clicks came as usual. Click, 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 beep. My voice was hoarse, coffee cold. I faded out the song, let the record scratch. Then I cued a final track and faded it under the recorded clicks, a loop of the pattern for 30 seconds. I ran it through the board, letting it bleed into the FM modulation. For those 30 seconds, the dorm students listening must have heard it too, a haunting digital pulse in the static. When the record ended, my shift was over. I muted the mic and stood in the empty studio, lights buzzing overhead. The clock read 6:02. I packed my bag, grabbed my printouts, and walked out into the hallway. The campus was silent, footprints echoing on linoleum. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and stared at the papers. I still had no clue what the numbers meant, or who was sending them. By next week, the calls stopped altogether. The phone line went quiet. The dead air stretched at minute past each hour, empty and still. I never got a final message, never heard a change in the clicks or a new pattern emerging. I deleted the recordings off my phone and tossed the graph sheets. The coordinates vanished into the recycling bin. But I know what I heard. In the dark hours, at the same minute past each hour, a voice of clicks and beeps tried to speak. And though I never followed the numbers they traced, I keep checking maps now, just in case someone somewhere still hears those patterns, dialing them in at 0:01 over and over, pointing to places that might explain everything. I was sitting in my car behind the old Ridgeway strip mall around 11:45 at night, parked near the dumpsters where the delivery trucks usually pull in. I'd been doing Instacart all evening and finished my last drop around 11:20. There's a bakery in that strip that leaves out extra bread sometimes, and a buddy of mine who works maintenance there told me it was fine to swing by late if I ever wanted any. So that's what I was doing, waiting to see if the guy had left anything out. The back of the building was pitch black, except for a single light above the service door. The bakery was dark inside. Looked like no one had stayed late, so I figured it was a bust. I didn't feel like heading straight home, though. I had this heavy, tired feeling, but wasn't quite ready for sleep, you know? So I just sat for a minute with the engine running, watching the steam rise off my hood in the cool air. It had rained earlier and everything was still wet. Big puddles across the lot reflecting the service lights. Clouds were hanging low, orange at the edges from the streetlights over by the main road. Dead quiet, except for the engine hum and some wind against the car. I leaned over into the passenger seat to dig through a bag for gum or something, and when I sat back up, there was this shape at the far end of the lot, hovering above the row of abandoned units. It was bright, not blinding, but way too white and too clean looking to be headlights or a floodlight. I couldn't tell what the shape was exactly. Not round, not a disc, not a triangle, just kind of there. Like my brain couldn't lock onto its edges, but I could see its reflection in the puddles. It hovered maybe 2 stories up, totally silent. I turned off my headlights right away, cut the engine too. Then I slid down low in the seat, heart pounding, and stared up at the roofline through the gap between the dash and the steering wheel. The thing wasn't moving. It just stayed where it was, glowing steady. I kept thinking maybe it was some kind of drone, but it didn't blink or shift or wobble like drones do. It was still. Way too still. My ears started ringing then, not high-pitched, more like a low, slow humming, not outside but inside my head. Not a sound exactly, but something I was aware of. It had this weird rhythm to it. Not musical, just pulsing, steady and slow, almost like a heartbeat, but not mine. I stayed hunched down like that for probably 2 minutes, barely breathing. I glanced at my phone once. No bars. That's not unusual back there, but added to the feeling like I'd been cut off from everything. When I finally looked up again, the thing was gone. Just gone. No movement, no fading, no rising into the clouds like someone flipped a switch. 1 second it was hovering above the roof, the next it wasn't. The puddles were dark again. The hum in my head didn't go away though, it kept going, same slow rhythm. I waited another 5 minutes before I started the car back up. I left the lights off and reversed out of the lot real slow. Didn't see anything in the mirrors. I drove around to the front of the strip mall just to check if maybe someone had been working late or filming something weird, but all the windows were dark. The whole front lot was empty. Even the 24-hour laundromat on the corner was closed for repairs. I was the only one there. When I pulled out onto the main road, I turned the radio on just to hear another voice. It came on, but the volume was low and muffled, like the speakers weren't fully working, and the hum in my ears was still there, still pulsing. It didn't line up with the music or anything, just did its own thing right underneath everything else. I kept driving with the windows cracked, trying to see if it was an actual sound in the air, but it wasn't. No matter what I did, it stayed the same, like it wasn't even in my ears, just inside me somehow. I know that sounds nuts, but that's how it felt. At home, I sat in the driveway with the engine off for a long time, just listening, still humming. Nothing out the window, no lights, no weird shapes in the sky. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd feel that slow throb behind them. Not painful, just present, like a finger tapping lightly inside my skull. Around 4 in the morning, it finally faded. No big moment. It just gradually stopped until I realized it wasn't there anymore. I didn't feel any different. Just weirdly alone when it went away, which made no sense. I didn't want it to come back, but part of me expected it to. The next day, I drove by the strip mall again during daylight. Everything looked normal. Cracked pavement, boarded up windows, nothing strange on the roof. I parked out back and got out just to be sure, walked the length of the building. No marks, no scorch, no equipment. I even checked the puddles for oil or weird residue. Nothing. No one else reported seeing anything that night. I asked my friend at the bakery if he'd left anything out, and he said no, hadn't worked that night. Said he'd been home all evening. I haven't been back since. I take the long way around now, even if it costs me extra gas. It's not about what I saw or didn't see. It's that sound, that slow, constant hum. It wasn't something I heard, it was something I felt. I was living in northern Saskatchewan back then, in a little town called Cumberland House. My girlfriend Tessa had gotten a forestry contract up there for the summer, and I tagged along since I could do remote work. Internet was spotty, but I'd been wanting to get away from the city for a while anyway. The place we rented was a tiny cabin, more like a glorified shed, about 20 minutes outside of town. Real quiet. Gravel road in, surrounded by trees on all sides. No neighbors you could see from the porch, which I liked. You'd hear the occasional ATV in the distance, but mostly it was birds, bugs, and the wind through the spruce. It happened in mid-July. Hot week. One of those weird heat waves where even the nights don't cool off. Bugs were out in full force, so we'd been mostly staying inside with the windows shut, running the fan nonstop. I remember that because the fan stopped working the night it happened. That was the first thing. It was around 11:40 p.m. I was reading in bed. Tessa was already out cold. The fan was on low, buzzing steady in the corner. Then it cut out. Not gradually, just click and nothing. I figured the breaker had tripped. I got up, checked the lamp, dead. Tried the kitchen switch. Nothing. But the weird part was outside. When I stepped onto the porch to see if the whole area was out, everything was too dark. Not just no lights, no stars, no moon. It wasn't cloudy. I could feel that it wasn't cloudy. It was like something had eaten the sky. I stood there for a minute, waiting for my eyes to adjust. But they didn't. The tree line was still visible in silhouette, but above it, just black. Not dark blue night sky black. I mean actual black. Like someone had cut a hole out of the sky and left a void behind. Then I noticed the wind was gone. Not just calm, dead still. The leaves weren't moving. Even the bugs had stopped. No buzzing, no frogs either. That silence wasn't peaceful. It felt off, like everything was holding its breath. I called back inside to Tessa, but she didn't answer. I walked into the bedroom and shook her shoulder. She blinked a few times and asked if the power was out. I said yeah, but something else was going on. I told her to come look. When we stepped out again, she froze in the doorway. "What's wrong with the sky?" she said. I didn't answer because I didn't know how to explain it. The black patch was massive, maybe a mile across, just hanging there over the trees to the west. No movement, no sound, just still. Then we both saw the stars shift. Not a shooting star, not a satellite. A cluster of stars, maybe a dozen, started to wobble. They didn't move across the sky. They shook in place, like reflections on disturbed water. Just for a second or two. Then they settled again. Tessa whispered, "Did you see that?" I nodded. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to mess with the silence. It felt like anything louder than a whisper would break something open. Then, way out in the dark, we saw a flicker. Not in the sky, in the trees. Like a single flash of heat lightning, except it was below the horizon line. Maybe be a few 100 feet off the ground. Soft orange, gone. We waited. No thunder, no more light. Just that dead silence. Tessa went back inside to check her phone. She called out that her screen wouldn't turn on. I checked mine. Black screen, no matter how many times I hit the power button. I tried her laptop too. Same thing. All the electronics were useless. I sat on the porch for maybe 20 more minutes. Nothing else happened. But I kept watching the sky, trying to catch the stars do that shimmer again. They didn't. The black patch never moved either. It just sat there like a stain above the trees. Eventually, I went back inside. The house was warm, fan still dead, but Tessa had managed to get back to sleep. I lay there in the dark, trying to calm my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that void above us getting lower. When I woke up, the power was back. The fan was humming. The fridge had kicked in again. My phone showed 7:12 a.m., and my last notification was from 11:36 the night before. Everything in the cabin looked normal. We didn't talk much that morning. Tessa seemed spooked, and I didn't want to push her about it. I made coffee, took it out onto the porch. Sky was clear, birds were chirping again, a couple dragonflies buzzed around. It was like nothing had happened. 2 days later, a local guy named Noel stopped by. He did odd jobs in the area, delivered firewood, hauled trash, that kind of thing. He was chatty, always had some weird story. I asked him, real casual, if there'd been any outages that night. He said, a few folks closer to town had flickering lights, but no one reported a full blackout. Then he told me something that stuck with me. You ever seen the sky shake? He said, like you're looking at it through a puddle? I looked at him and he nodded slow, like he already knew the answer. I saw it a few times when I was younger, he said. Always late, always summer. Stars go all funny, makes your teeth hurt. I didn't say anything. Later that week, we went into town to use the public Wi-Fi at the library. While Tessa was printing documents for her fieldwork, I looked up recent weather satellite images. Just curious. There was a daily loop from that night, July 14th. I found a frame around midnight that showed a clean black circle right over our area. No cloud cover, no radar signal, just a missing chunk like the data hadn't recorded. Every other frame was normal, but that one stood out like a bruise on a map. I saved it. Tried to find official notes on the anomaly. Nothing. We stayed another month, and nothing else like that happened again. But every clear night after that, I found myself checking the stars a little longer than usual, waiting to see if they'd ripple. I was driving back from my cousin's place in Illinois around the middle of June. He lives out in Mattoon, and I'd taken a few days off work to help him tear down an old shed and move some junk off his property. Nothing exciting, just a hot, boring stretch of Midwest chores. I left late Sunday night because I wanted to beat the Monday traffic, and I've always liked driving at night. It was just after 11:30 p.m. When I hit that long stretch of farmland along Route 16 heading east. No towns for miles, just soy fields and a few broken down barns scattered along the road. You'd see a house light every now and then, but mostly it was pitch black except for my high beams. No moon that night, just a sky full of stars. My phone was on the seat next to me, playing old episodes of some comedy podcast I barely paid attention to. I had the windows cracked, letting the warm air in. Nothing weird at all. I was just cruising at about 55, trying to keep an eye out for deer. I passed a sign for a place called Shelbyville Road, then maybe 5 minutes later, everything died. Like everything. The dash lights went out. The engine cut. My headlights shut off completely. Even the glow of my phone screen vanished. At first, I thought I'd hit a bump or something had shorted, but the radio was dead. Interior lights, dead. The needles on the speedometer and fuel gauge dropped like the battery had been yanked out. And it was silent. No hum from the engine, no tires on the road, just the noise of the wind disappearing as the car rolled to a stop. I hit the brakes and the pedal was weird, soft, no resistance. I coasted over to the shoulder and just sat there. The only light came from the stars, and even that felt dimmer, like the sky had dulled somehow. I tried to turn the key again, and nothing. No click, no crank. I pushed the hazard button, but the dash didn't even blink. My wristwatch had stopped too, dead center between 11:36 and 11:37. I tapped the glass and listened, but it had gone silent. The weirdest part was how calm it felt. No panic, just confusion. I wasn't even scared yet. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, trying to figure out what could have caused everything to shut down at the same time. I remember wondering if I'd driven through a puddle or clipped a wire, but it hadn't rained in days. That's when the orange light showed up. It came from behind, maybe 100 feet up in the air. I didn't hear it at first. Just noticed a glow forming in the rearview mirror. Dull, orangey, almost the color of a street lamp through fog. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to place what it could be. No vehicle sound, no rumble, just that low, warm light getting closer, slowly moving directly over my car. I stuck my head out the window to look up. It wasn't a beam, it wasn't flashing, it wasn't moving fast either, just drifting, steady, like a cloud catching the sunset, except there was no sun. The shape of it was hard to describe, not a perfect circle, more like a squashed oval, glowing from the underside. The color reminded me of old sodium lights at gas stations, kind of brownish orange, almost sickly. It moved smooth as glass over the road. As it passed directly above me, I felt something in my chest. Not pain, just pressure. Like standing too close to a speaker with the bass turned up, except I couldn't hear anything. My ears popped like I was changing elevation. My teeth ached. Even the air felt thick, like I was breathing through a warm rag. And then it was gone. 10 seconds, maybe less. The light kept going east, never speeding up or slowing down. I leaned out the window as far as I could and watched it glide silently over the fields, then vanish behind a row of distant trees. Still no sound, not even a breeze. Right after it disappeared, my dash lights came on. No warning tones or error codes, just full power, like I'd turned the key myself. My headlights blinked back on. The phone screen lit up again, still playing the same podcast, frozen for a second before skipping ahead like it had lost connection. The engine started humming again, like nothing had happened. I looked down at my watch. The second hand ticked forward. 11:37. Everything was back. I sat there for a while before I started driving again. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I didn't feel right. Not sick, just disoriented, like I'd just come out of anesthesia. I kept flexing my fingers on the steering wheel, making sure everything was moving okay. When I finally pulled back onto the road, the air felt cooler. The sky looked normal again. Stars were sharp, no more of that strange haze. I checked the radio, flipped through local stations. Nothing unusual, just static and country music. I passed 2 cars over the next hour, both coming from the other direction. I almost flagged the second one down just to ask if they'd seen anything, but I didn't. I made it home around 2:15 in the morning. My roommate, Darren, was asleep on the couch. I didn't mention anything to him. I went straight to my room, plugged my phone in, and stared at the screen until sunrise. I kept replaying the moment the light passed over, trying to remember the shape, the glow, the way it felt in my chest. Next morning, I checked the car for electrical issues. Nothing. Battery was fine, alternator tested normal, no blown fuses. I even took it into the shop 2 days later, just to be sure. They didn't find a thing. The only thing I noticed after the fact was the watch. It started losing time, just by a couple seconds each day. Then it stopped ticking altogether about a week later. I replaced the battery, still dead. I keep it in a drawer now along with the shirt I wore that night. I haven't driven that stretch of Route 16 again. Not because I'm scared, just because I don't need to. Once was enough. I stepped away from the fire just after 10, telling Sarah and Javier I needed to pee. The clearing was lit by embers and sparks drifting up into the pines, but I wanted more privacy. Figured I'd head up a little slope a dozen yards from camp, where trees thinned out. I brushed past low branches, boots crunching over pine needles, and paused when I noticed how quiet it was. At camp, the fire crackled and my friends were swapping stories, but up here, the forest felt hushed, like it was holding its breath. I found a stand of saplings and turned my back to the firelight. As I zipped up, I heard something. A soft shift, like cloth against cloth, off to my left, maybe 20 feet away. My heart tapped faster. I tossed a glance over my shoulder, but saw nothing in the gloom. I shook it off. Night noises play tricks. I turned back toward camp, but stopped. The fire's glow looked small from here, like a distant campfire in a painting. And beyond, it was a steep ridge topped by a shelf of granite just under a canopy of stars. The air was cool, easy to suck in. No bugs, no breeze. That's when I saw it. A shape at the ridge crest, silhouetted against the Milky Way's band of light. At first I thought it was one of us, maybe Javier wandering back from the latrine, but it was unmoving, impossibly still. The figure was tall, too tall for a person standing on uneven rock, and its shoulders were narrow. No flash of flashlight or glow from a phone, just absolute blackness against the sky. I called out softly, "Hey, Javier?" My voice felt shrill. The forest didn't answer. I took a step forward, then another, boots scraping on granite. The figure didn't flinch. I squinted to make out details. Nothing. No hair, no clothes, no facial features, just a dark form obscure against the stars. I cleared my throat. "Chavi, you up there?" My pulse thumped in my ears. A rock scraped under my foot. I looked down, then up again, and the shape had backed away. Not walked, just slid backward, like a shadow being drawn away from the light. It retreated 3 or 4 feet, and then it vanished altogether, swallowed by the pitch of the ridge. My legs turned to jelly. I wanted to sprint back to the fire to the safety of my friends' laughter. Instead, I froze. The stars leaked through that empty notch where the figure had been, exactly as before, as if nothing had ever stood there. I swallowed hard and called out again, louder this time. Javier! Sarah! My voice bounced off tree trunks and died. I waited. The only answer was the thump of my own heart. Finally, I took off, stumbling down the slope. The forest around me felt alien. Every mossy log, every low branch seemed to reach for me. I kept my eyes on the firelight, flickering through the trees until I burst into camp, panting like I'd run a mile. Sarah looked up from her marshmallow. Dude, what? Up there, I gasped, pointing at the ridge. Figure, somebody was standing on the rock shelf. It backed away and then it just disappeared. Javier laughed. Dude, this isn't a horror movie. Come sit. He patted the log where I'd been earlier. You okay? I sat, but I kept glancing back the way I'd run. The forest edge looked empty. The firelight seemed brighter and somehow too close, like it was too small to protect us. My hands shook as I sipped my beer. We talked nonsense for a while. Camping logistics, when to break camp in the morning, the right way to cook bacon over coals. But I couldn't focus. Every once in a while, I'd look up at that ridge, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes or that dark outline perched on the rock. Night deepened. Sarah crawled into her tent. Javier cleaned up. I wrapped my hammock tighter around me, but sleep refused to come. I lay there watching the sparks rise, imagining them drifting up to light that ridge again. Once, I thought I heard a footstep behind me, soft on the pine needles. I turned, heart hammering, but the campsite was empty. No one else had left the fire. Only the night noises, distant frogs, the crack of sap dripping onto coals, the thud of logs settling in the heat. I finally drifted towards sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape retreating up that slope, a void moving against the stars. In the morning, I hiked up to where I thought it had stood, loose granite, low tufts of grass, nothing else. I scanned every crevice, every shadow, but there was only rock and moss. No footprints, no scrap of fabric, no sign that anyone had stood there. The dew was still fresh. I didn't mention it on the drive back home. Sarah and Javier chattered about breakfast and next weekend's plans. I stared out the truck window at the passing fields, thinking about the stillness, the shape, the way it had stepped back and vanished like it wasn't meant to be seen. Now, whenever night falls and I look up at the stars, I wonder if something else is out there, watching, patient, waiting on a ridge crest just beyond the flicker of my campfire. It started during that big thunderstorm we had last September, the one that rolled through central Missouri and knocked out power for half the county. It was late, around 1:30 a.m., and I was up because the wind had woken me. Not unusual. I've got a couple big oaks in the backyard, and when they move, they move. The rain was coming down hard. I could hear it slamming against the kitchen windows and rattling the vent above the stove. The wind had that low, constant roar behind it, not gusts, just this steady wall of air, like the whole world was blowing sideways. Every few seconds, lightning would light up the yard, almost like daylight, and then everything would go black again. I remember standing at the sliding glass door with a mug of coffee, just watching the trees and trying to time the thunder. I wasn't scared, just waiting for the power to go out. It usually does when we get anything that's strong. That's when I saw it. There was a patch in the yard, maybe 20 feet across near the back fence, where the rain wasn't hitting. Not just a little less rain, none. It looked like someone had cut a perfect circle out of the storm. Everything else was soaked. You could see the water rippling across the lawn, blowing sideways in the wind. But this spot, dead center in the yard, was bone dry. No rain, no wind. Just stillness. I stepped outside under the overhang to get a better look. The moment I opened the door, I noticed something else. The noise dropped. It was still raining hard everywhere else, but the sound didn't feel right, like it was muffled somehow. Even the thunder sounded distant, like hearing it through thick glass. I didn't step off the patio, but I watched that circle for at least 5 minutes. The rain just slid off it, bending around the edge like there was some kind of invisible dome. It wasn't steam or mist or anything, it was just dry. The lightning kept flashing, and in those bright moments, I could see the grass inside the circle was pushed flat. But not randomly. It had a spiral to it, like someone had dragged a rake around the center a few times. I didn't go out there. Not that night. I checked the camera the next morning. I've got a motion-activated security cam pointed right at the yard, mostly to keep an eye on raccoons. The footage from the storm cut out at 1:31 a.m. Right when I saw the circle, and didn't start again until 3:28 a.m., that whole stretch was just static. Not black screen, not no signal. Static, like old TV snow. The rest of the footage before and after looked fine. Clear image, good audio, just that one 2-hour block, completely useless. I walked out into the yard around 7 when the rain had stopped. Everything was soaked except that spot. It was still dry. The spiral was clearer in the daylight. Maybe 6 or 7 rings, flattened perfectly, all curling clockwise toward the center. The grass looked pressed down, not broken or torn. It had that damp, matted texture, like someone had been sitting there for a long time. I tried to brush it upright with my hand, but it stayed down. The air in that spot felt different too, colder. Not a lot, just a few degrees maybe, but it was enough to notice. I stood inside the edge for a few seconds, and my arms got goosebumps, even though it was already warming up for the day. I didn't stay there long. I checked the camera again after work, thinking maybe it had just glitched or lost power, but the weird part was, everything else around that time frame recorded fine. I've got a second cam near the driveway. That one picked up the storm, me walking around the kitchen, even the porch light flickering during the worst of it. But the backyard cam didn't log anything except static. No motion alerts, no system errors. Later that week, I had a guy from work come by. Kenny, he used to install those types of systems. I didn't tell him what happened, just asked him to check if the camera had shorted out or something. He looked it over, checked the footage and said there was no power loss, no corruption in the file. He couldn't explain the static. Said it looked like interference, but there was no obvious source. That spiral lasted 4 more days. Every morning I'd go out and it'd still be there, perfectly shaped, totally dry. It even stayed dry through a second rainstorm that hit the following Tuesday. Rained hard again, same as before, and once more the rest of the yard turned to mush, but that circle stayed untouched. On the 5th morning, it was gone. Not the flattened grass, that was still there, but the dryness, the coldness, that weird, still air. Everything felt normal again. The grass started springing back up that afternoon. A week later, you could barely see where it had been, just a faint ring of yellowed blades where it had stayed pressed the longest. I still check the cameras every now and then. Nothing like that's happened again. But sometimes if I'm standing at the window at night and the wind's blowing just right, I swear the grass shifts a little in that spot, like it remembers. I was driving east on State Route 89, somewhere between Tonopah and Beatty, just before dawn. The sky was turning pale gray, and the air still held the chill from the night's cold. I'd been on the road since midnight, hauling parts for a solar farm installation out near Goldfield. That stretch is just endless desert. Nothing but sagebrush and red rocks. No towns for 30 miles either way. Around 5:15 a.m., I saw headlights in my mirror about half a mile back. They were bright but oddly diffuse, like LED light stripped of its beam pattern. I tapped the brakes to drop from 65 to 60 and watched them approach. When the leader drew level, I glanced over and saw 6 identical SUVs. Matte gray, no markings, no plates, like they'd been airbrushed out of a catalog. No runners on their rooftops, no antennas, just solid, flat surfaces. They were all the same make, boxy, vaguely military-issue profile. They didn't flash lights or tailgate. Just slipped past in a single line, exhaust quiet. I thought maybe some corporate shuttles or new government vehicles doing testing, but that many together seemed odd. They accelerated smoothly and pulled ahead. I shrugged and pressed on. 10 minutes later, I rounded a bend that crosses a dry wash. There, off to the right where the desert flattens out, I saw them again, parked in a perfect row, 6 SUVs exactly like before. They were maybe 200 feet off the road, in the gravel. Everyone faced uphill toward a low red mesa, skyward. I hit the brakes again, pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, and killed the engine. I sat for a moment, listening to the wind rattle through my mirrors. The SUVs sat dead silent. No running engines, no movement inside. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see silhouettes. But all six were lined up like sentinels. Equal spacing, equal distance. Someone had driven in, parked exactly, turned off, and climbed out. But I saw no footprints, only the rippled sand around the tires. I grabbed my binoculars from the passenger seat and peered at them. Tires were buried slightly, so they'd been there at least an hour, long enough for wind to blow sand. Yet I distinctly saw them pass me only minutes ago. Clean tires and tires kicking up dust. That didn't compute. I put the binos down and stepped out, flashlight in hand. I walked about 50 feet toward the first SUV, watching the others line up like a squad. The chorus of sparse desert birds was faint, distant, nothing close. No people, no dogs, just that line of identical metal. At the leading vehicle, I swept my light across the hood. Nothing. No logo, no bolts where a plate would mount. The grille was a single, smooth surface. I knocked on the side panel. Thud, hollow undercoat. Quiet. I crouched to look under the wheel well. The chassis was clean, no dust or debris. Odd, given the wind and sand. I stood back up. The sky above the mesa looked empty, gray, not a hint of cloud. But something felt off, like the sky was watching too. I looked back at the road. It was still empty, no other cars. I checked my watch, 5:25, 10 minutes after I passed the convoy. But the SUVs already looked like they'd been there longer, based on wind buildup. I zipped back to my truck, hands shaking. I hit the lights off switch on the console, cab lights off, engine still silent. I grabbed my phone, checked signal, none. CB radio was dead air. I keyed the mic and clicked through channels, nothing. I slipped into the driver's seat and slipped the rig into drive. Engine turned over on the first crank, rumbled to life. I backed onto the highway and eased past the parked SUVs. They stayed lined up, facing that same patch of sky. I drove slowly, 40 miles an hour, never taking my eyes off them. At the Mesa Crest, they slipped out of sight. I thumped the steering wheel, tried dialing dispatch to report the sighting. No bars. I opened my window and shouted into the desert. "Anybody there?" Only wind answered, carrying grit through the cabins. I didn't see them again on the trip in or out. At sunrise, I rolled into town, pulled into a diner parking lot, and sat outside sipping bad coffee. The parking lot lights cast long shadows. I watched the horizon for movement, half expecting to see matte gray shapes glinting in the sun's first rays. But nothing. The diner opened at 6. I went inside, ordered an omelet and bacon, and watched the highway through the front window. A few pickup trucks rolled by, nothing unusual. The waitress asked if I was waiting on freight, and I gave her a nod but didn't elaborate. She'd probably think I was joking or tired. I stayed until 7, then climbed back in the rig and headed south on 95. The rest of the drive was normal. Radio static, rig vibrations, the occasional cattle guard. No matte gray SUVs. No inexplicable formations. Now, weeks later, I still think about it. I've driven that stretch again at dawn, at dusk, in rain, but I never find that group again. The wind reshapes the sand, erasing whatever traces they'd left. Sometimes I wonder if I dozed off and dreamed it, but I remember the thunk of my knuckles on the SUV, the exact spacing, the way the tires sank under drifting sand. Most nights now, I sleep light, dreaming of boxy silhouettes in the desert, all staring silent and still at a sky that didn't seem right. I flipped the lever on the rickety louvers and scanned the valley below at dusk. The sky was bruised purple, clouds hugging the ridge a few miles west of the Mount Laramie lookout. I'm Ranger Beth Howard, been manning this tower every summer for 5 years. Tonight was supposed to be routine. No new fires, no storms, just watching for poachers or cigarette butts from campers. At 8:12 p.m., I glanced at the digital clock on the scanner, just in time to hear the last chime of the hour on the Forest Service radio. Static crackled afterward, but no traffic. I keyed the mic, called back over channel 3, then heard something else, a faint throbbing hum. So low I thought it was the generator shifting gears. But the generator sat silent in its shed, set to auto only if house batteries dipped. This hum rose and fell twice before fading, and that's when I noticed the light. At first it was a tiny dot, hard to pick out against the darkening pines. I lifted my binoculars, no glint of a propeller, no blinking wingtip light. It was a single orb, pulsing red once every 2 seconds. It hovered above the tree line, maybe 1,500 feet up. What grabbed me was the speed. It was descending so slowly I thought a reflection from a plane's wing was drifting down, but I tracked it for another 20 seconds. It sank maybe 10 feet in that whole time. I set the bins down and listened. Nothing but the wind whispering past the tower's windows. No whir of rotors, no distant rumble. I pressed my forehead against the glass and watched the red glow come closer, brighter. Around 8:15, it paused, perfectly still against the sky, like someone hit pause on a video. For 30 seconds it pulsed, red, then dark, each beat pressing in the air so I could almost feel it against my chest. I glanced at the scanner, static still, no voices, no alerts. My hands tingled, then it moved again, straight down, not drifting, not swooping, just plummeting at high speed. I blinked, and it was gone. No crash, not a flicker of sound, no sparks or falling debris, just empty air where a moment before that orb had hovered. I jammed open the tower door, grabbed my flashlight, and raced down the ladder. The lower deck creaked underfoot. At the bottom, I flicked on the hand lantern and jogged toward the edge of the clearing. The forest there was thick, fir and spruce, trunks shrouded in moss. The ground was covered in fresh pine needles and fallen leaves. I swept the beam around, expecting at least a smolder or a glow where it hit. Nothing. No broken branches, no scorch. The hum was gone, replaced by the usual chorus of crickets and a distant owl hoot. Even the wind sounded normal, rippling through branches. I checked my phone. Dead. No signal up here. I pulled out my backup satellite tracker, tapped the emergency button. A soft beep acknowledged it. Whatever was out there, I figured I'd better let base know. Climbing back to the tower, I felt watched, like something was passing just beyond the tree line, keeping pace as I moved. I paused at the ladder, heart drumming, and listened. For a second, I thought I heard a soft click like a camera shutter, but it could have been a falling pine cone. I made it back inside and locked the door. My recorder was still on the table, blinking red. I hit play. Static again, nothing but white noise at channel 3. No alarm, no alert tone, no explanation for a red light dropping into the forest and vanishing. I sat down in the swivel chair, shook my head to clear it. Outside, the valley lights twinkled. Towns, campgrounds, roads, all normal. The firefinder dials were dark, pointing at familiar peaks. No new anomalies. At 9 p.m., I grabbed my coffee mug, cold by then, and filled it at the little sink. The sky had deepened to ink. I leaned against the louvers and stared out. Everything seemed still, steady. The world settled like a book closing. I finished my shift at midnight, jotting notes in the log. 8:12 to 8:45 p.m., observed pulsing red light descending slowly, hovering, then shooting down. No sound, no impact found. Radio and comms clear. I locked up the tower, climbed into my truck, and drove down the winding dirt road back to the ranger cabin. The headlights cut islands of brightness in the woods. My knuckles white on the wheel. I glanced in the mirror. No lights behind me, nothing sliding through the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, dawn was nowhere close. I set the logbook on the desk and boiled water for tea. Outside, coyotes began yipping. Birds stirred at the edge of the clearing. I told the relief ranger what happened the next morning. He raised an eyebrow and said county helicopters had radar glitches between 8:15 and 8:20 but couldn't nail a cause. That was all the official word I got. Now, every time dusk falls and the sky dims behind the tower, I half expect to see a pulsing red dot reappear above the tree line, descending frame by frame toward an impact that never comes, and to hear nothing as it vanishes again. I reached the summit just after dawn, wind cold against my cheeks, and tapped Jenna's arm. "Come here, quick," I said, raising my phone. We turned our backs to the sunrise, fiery pink over the Sawtooth Ridge, and squeezed together for a selfie. I framed our heads with the valley below, clouds drifting between the peaks. Jenna grinned, hair whipping in the breeze, and I hit the shutter. We stayed a few more minutes, sipping water, scanning the slopes for mountain goats. The air smelled like damp pine and frost. I remember hearing a single crow call, loud and sudden, then nothing. No wind in the needles, no other birds answering. We shrugged it off, packed up, and started downhill. Back at the trailhead that afternoon, sipping lukewarm coffee, Jenna scrolled through the photos. Let's see how that selfie turned out. She zoomed in on our faces, joked about my double chin, then flipped to the next shot. The empty summit. That's when she stopped scrolling. "Did you see that?" she asked, voice small. I glanced up. "See what? Look here." She tapped the summit photo with her finger, then zoomed out to the larger image. At the far left, on a distant ridge where only rock and sparse grass should be, a dark shape stood. Tall, long limbs, slender torso, and clearly facing us, not blurred or pixelated. Sharp enough to be real. I blinked. But there was nobody up there. We'd been the only ones on the summit. I remembered checking behind every outcrop, every boulder. No footprints, no human voices. I tapped to compare. The shot before our selfie, just empty ridge. The one after, empty ridge. Only the selfie frame showed the shape. My chest tightened. "Did you zoom in?" She did. The figure was maybe 100 yards away, too far to hear or see with the naked eye. Head tilted slightly, arms at its sides. No detail, just a silhouette darker than the shadowed rock behind it. I swallowed and leaned forward. "Could be a trick of light." She shook her head. "The pixel values are pure black. No lens flare, no blur." I tapped the photo again. The sky behind the figure glowed pale, but the shape was matte. It didn't reflect any of that dawn light. Jenna scrolled through the rest of the photos. Nothing. The ridge stayed empty. "What do we do?" she asked. We talked about it on the drive home, joking at first, maybe an elk standing weird, but the laughter felt hollow. I decided to go back up the next morning, same time with binoculars and my camera with a long lens. I set off at first light, dew soaking my boots. The trail was quiet, too quiet. The usual rattle of chipmunks and songbirds was missing. All I heard was the creek trickling under logs. My skin prickled. I paused to listen. Nothing but my breath in the trees. I made the climb in record time, heart thumping. At the summit, I scanned every ridge with binos. North, south, east. No shape. Not a rock stump, not a person. The grasses and stones were exactly where they should be. I snapped a few pictures, dozens from different angles. I even turned my back and faced away, then pivoted to recheck the ridge. Nothing. I sat on a flat boulder, hands shaking, and watched for half an hour. A single marmot scampered by, yipping once, then vanished down its hole. A breeze stirred, coaxing new shadows on the slopes. I tried to convince myself it was a power outage in my phone, a glitch in processing. The marmot returned, yipped again, and scurried off. I climbed down, exhausted, hands tingling. Back home, I hooked my phone to the charger and waited. By afternoon, I had pictures to compare. The summit shots were empty, just mountain and sky. I loaded the selfie frame into my computer, zoomed in pixel by pixel, and saw it again, that black silhouette on the ridge. I manipulated the contrast, still pure black. I overlaid the empty summit shots, and the shape appeared only in the single cell of the selfie. The date and timestamp, 6:03 a.m., same as I remembered. No duplicates, no other frames, just that one image with something standing there. I met Jenna at a diner that evening. The place smelled of bacon and grease. We barely touched our burgers. "Maybe it's best to let it go," she said. I nodded, but my mind replayed that silhouette. Too tall, too still, too deliberate. I kept thinking about that morning silence, the absence of birds, the whispers in the grass. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I could still see the shape framed by dawn's golden light. I wondered if it was watching us from some distance, just beyond sight. I reached for my phone, pulled up the selfie, and zoomed in once more. The silhouette stood there, silent, waiting, before vanishing again into black pixels. I woke up to a pulsing glow seeping through the thin walls of my tent. It was around 2 a.m., and the night had been quiet. Just the low hiss of wind through lodge poles and the distant rush of Boulder Creek. I unzipped my sleeping bag, peeled back the tent flap, and squinted into the light. Outside, everything was bathed in this soft, rhythmic orange glow, like someone had hung a paper lantern 100 feet above camp and was turning it on and off. I climbed out on wobbly legs, the pine needles cold under my bare feet. My headlamp lay on the ground by my pack. I snapped it on and pointed it toward the sky. At first, I saw nothing but trees, dark silhouettes against a dim haze. Then I noticed the light was coming from above the ridge, way beyond the treetops, moving in a slow, pulsing rhythm. Curious and uneasy, I grabbed my compass and stepped away from the tent, careful not to slip on the frost. The glow traced a path overhead. I watched it pulse twice, then pause, then pulse twice again. As I followed its pattern, I realized it wasn't a lantern or firefly swarm. It was higher than any craft I'd seen, too steady to be natural. I fumbled for my phone and tapped my star map app, but there was no signal. Even so, I spread the downloaded map out on the ground and tried to match the constellations against the sky. But the stars above were unfamiliar. I scanned North America's Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, Arcturus. Nothing lined up. The sky looked like another hemisphere altogether. When the glow pulsed again, I noticed a low hum, almost inaudible, vibrating through the soil. My boots tingled with each pulse. I held my breath until it faded, leaving only the creek's murmur and my ragged breathing. A sudden snap of a branch somewhere made my heart jump. I swung the headlamp toward the underbrush. No movement, just trees and shadows. I thought I heard footsteps crunching behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing but my own tracks in the dirt. My skin crawled. I retreated toward the tent, thinking to wake my friend, Julian, but stopped. The glow had stopped pulsing, and the sky overhead was pitch black again, except for stars I didn't recognize. It felt wrong to break the night's hush with a whisper, so I sat on my pack and watched, trying to make sense of the sky's shape. Once the glow returned, fainter this time, it hovered to the south, just above the ridgeline. No sound, just that pulsing color, blinking out the constellations behind it. I closed my eyes, expecting whooshing or engines, but all I felt was the steady vibration in my chest. I could feel time stretching. My watch ticked forward, but something about those minutes felt warped. When I finally glanced at the app map again, frozen constellations stared back at me. The arrangement didn't fit any hemisphere or season. It was like I'd peered into a window on another world. The glow faded to nothing. The stars flipped back to a familiar pattern, Sirius and Vega shining where they should. I blinked and rubbed my face, willed my pulse to calm. I crawled back into the tent, zipped myself in, and lay awake until dawn, listening to the creek and the wind. Morning light came slow, washing over the campsite in muted pinks. I crawled out, stiff and uncertain. Later, I compared photos I'd taken of the sky to star charts in the guidebook I carry. Nothing matched. I asked the ranger at the station if anyone reported strange lights. He shook his head. "Just meteors last night," he said. On the drive home, I stared out at ordinary country roads, felt ordinary engine hum. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that strange constellation and the pulsing glow, and I wondered what I'd stumbled into, and if it was looking back. I'd pulled into the state park just after sunset, hoping to catch the Milky Way rising over Lake Nevada. It was late July, and the night air was warm, but still held a hint of chill by the shore. I parked at the boat launch, grabbed a folding chair and my thermos of tea, and walked down to the water's edge. The mosquitoes were lazy enough that I didn't need repellent, just the soft buzz of cicadas and the slap of water against docks. I settled on a flat rock a few feet from the shoreline. The lake was glassy, reflecting the tree line perfectly. I sat cross-legged, teacup in hand, and watched the first stars come out. Cassiopeia peeked through gaps in the first, and by 10:30 the sky was dense with pinpricks of light. Then I saw it. A dark triangle drifting across the star field. At first I thought it was a flock of birds, but it moved too smoothly. No blinking lights, no flapping or motion blur, just a solid, silent shape a few hundred feet up. It blocked out star clusters as it passed, its edges crisp against the sky. I held my breath. My tea went cold in my lap. The rock at my back felt too solid, like a lifeline to the ground. The shape slid westward, drifting at a steady pace like a puff of smoke caught on a breeze. I leaned forward, trying to catch its reflection in the lake. But the water stayed a flawless mirror of sky and treetops. No triangular blotch, no distortion. My pulse thumped in my ears. I glanced down at the shoreline, smooth pebbles and weeds, but saw no wave or shadow. The shape had to be directly overhead to blot the stars like that, but there was nothing on the water's surface to suggest it had been there. It passed beyond the tree line in maybe 15 seconds. I stared at the dark band above the pines, waiting for it to reappear on the other horizon. It never did. I crept to my feet and scanned the sky, turning slowly, expecting to see something slipping away into the distance. Instead, the sky was empty, just the constellations sliding with Earth's rotation. I sank back onto the rock, bewildered. The lake remained still, mirror smooth. No breeze, no insects suddenly swarming, only the quiet slap of water against the rock where I'd stepped. Then I saw it, a single ripple, like a long fingertip brushing the surface, radiating outward in concentric circles. The arc began a few yards out and moved toward me, flattening that perfect reflection. The point of origin was a patch of black nothing. No moonlight flicker, no glitter of fish scales, just dark water breaking into motion. I watched the ripple grow until it lapped at my toes and evaporated on the shore. My heart felt hollow, the tea bottle rattling in my hand. I scanned the trees on either side. Nothing, just shadows and shapes. I gathered my chair and teacup, legs shaking, and backed away from the water. I didn't look up again. The forest birds had begun their distant calls. The bugs were kicking back in, circling my headlamp and the rock. At the car, I pressed my palms to the hood to steady myself. My phone had 0 bars. I locked every door and sat with the engine running, listening to the tick of the cooling radiator. When I finally dared look at the sky again, I saw nothing but my reflection in the windshield. Eyes wide, hair mussed, and the same endless spread of stars. I drove home slowly, headlights low, ears straining at every rustle beyond the roadside pines. By the time I turned into my driveway, the sky was gray with dawn, and the lake's ripple was gone, leaving no sign of anything having been there. I brought the teacup in with me, set it on the counter, and left the porch light on all morning. I was settled on a fallen log just before first light, glassing the opening ahead with my binoculars. Cold November wind had rattled the pines all night, and the ground was crunchy underfoot when I hiked in. My name's Carl, and I've been tracking deer around the Bitterroot Range for longer than I care to admit. That morning, the air felt sharper than usual, like someone had sharpened reality. I spotted movement at the far edge of the clearing about 6:10 a.m. Through the bins, it looked like a single doe stepping out from behind a cedar. She moved stiffly, almost mechanically. Her legs jerked in these uneven staccato steps. One hoof down, pause, the next hoof down, pause again. It wasn't the fluid gait I'd seen thousands of times. It was as if the world had dropped frames and she couldn't catch up. I held my breath and kept watching. No wind, or if there was, it didn't ripple the grass. The deer looked straight ahead, ears erect but frozen. I thought maybe she was injured, but the way she moved made me think driverless toy on a rough track. I raised my voice, quiet, just to break the tension. Hey! Nothing. She kept her awkward shuffle, heading toward full view behind a scraggly bush. I squinted and wiped fog from the lenses. Up close, her coat looked dull, too matte for morning sun. I expected birds to flush or squirrels to scamper, but the woods around me stayed deathly still. She cleared the brush and took 3 more stuttering steps into the open. I leaned forward, heart thumping, and tapped my rifle bolt. Test! Test! When I looked back, she flickered. 1 second she was there, head bowed, ribs visible under fluffed hair, legs twitching. Next, a brief blur like when you scroll a paused frame, and then nothing. No leap, no turn, no run, just gone. A sudden gust kicked up gravel at my boots, louder than the rest of the morning. The clearing's grass sighed under wind that I didn't notice until then. My binoculars slipped from my hands. I caught them with a jerk, scanning every tree line, every shadow patch. Nothing moved. No deer terrified through brush. No distant hoot or snort. I glanced at my watch. 6:12. 2 minutes since I'd first seen her. Time felt stretched, like running in place. I checked the ground where she'd stood. No hoof prints. No indentations in the dew. Fresh leaves lay unbroken. It was like she'd existed only in bone and muscle and then evaporated. My pulse rattled in my ears. I slid the scope back onto my rifle, shouldered it, and turned for the trail. I didn't even think about taking another shot. I stepped off the log and headed downhill, boots cutting a new path that erased old ones. I didn't stop until I was back at the truck. My fingers had gone numb, but I still fumbled the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sat for a moment in the seat, staring out at the clearing from the windshield. The grass glowed pale in the rising sun, no sign someone had been there. I backed out onto the road and drove west through the pines, leaving the Bitterroot behind. The sunrise was soft and gold, turning the peaks to rose. I didn't look back. I was finishing up spraying the apple orchard long past sunset around 9:15 p.m. when I noticed the quiet. I'd driven the tractor down every row, and the engine noise had masked most of the evening sounds. But when I turned it off by the far end of the field, everything stopped. No crickets, no rustle of leaves, not even a soft breeze. I left the tractor idling and climbed down, wiping my hands on my jeans. I glanced at my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual out here. What was odd was how the air felt. Still, heavy, like it was holding its breath. I stood there for a bit, only the distant pond's surface blinking under the moonlight. Normally I'd hear frogs, maybe the hourly hoot of an owl. Nothing. I tapped the hood of the tractor to coax the engine back, but before I could hit the starter, the lights on the cab dimmed. They didn't flicker, just faded to half brightness, then lower, until it looked like the porch light at home dying on the verge of going out. My stomach knotted. I leaned against the back tire and peered into the rows. The orchard was in shadow, but I could just make out the shapes of trees. Then I saw it. Every tree's shadow, the ones still lit by that faint glow, twisted in the same direction, like ribbons stuck on a breeze. But the breeze wasn't there. All the shadows pointed east, at a sharp, impossible angle. I grabbed my flashlight from my jacket and snapped it on. The beam cut through the dark, but the shadows stayed. Every gnarled branch cast a line toward the same point beyond the hill, no matter where the trunk stood, no matter how the trees were planted. I felt my mouth go dry. Then the lights came back. The cab lights flared bright for a heartbeat, then steadied to normal, like someone had turned a switch back on. I jumped, heart thumping, and grabbed the steering wheel. The engine held its idle. I looked at my watch, analog with a little date window. It had been 9:17. Now it read 9:31. 14 minutes ahead. I'd sworn I'd only been out here maybe 3 or 4 minutes. I checked it again. 9:31. Sure enough. I climbed down and walked through the nearest rows, peering for footprints, tire tracks, anything out of place. But the ground was firm, not even a broken twig. I kicked at a low branch. No movement. The orchard looked untouched. I sat on the tractor's fender and let my head rest against the cab. My breath sounded loud, too loud, in the stillness. I tapped my pocket to make sure my phone was still there, though it wouldn't have mattered without signal. Finally, I climbed back in, started the engine, and drove to the barn. Headlights carved a path through the trees. I didn't look back. At the barn door, I killed the lights and sat for a moment before climbing down again. Back in the house, I flicked on every lamp, every overhead light. The kitchen clock said 9, clock said 9:45. Later than my watch had said. I washed my hands and stood looking out the window at the orchard. Moonlight slanted across the trunks, shadows all over the place in every direction. I grabbed a screwdriver from the drawer and adjusted my watch, nudging the hands back 14 minutes. The ticking seemed louder after that. I didn't sleep well. Every creak and whisper of wind felt amplified. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like a soft hum coming from outside, like distant machinery, but it faded quickly. At dawn, I drove out to the orchard again. Everything looked normal, straight rows, even morning light, no weird shadow angles, no dimmed lights. I checked the tractor. No signs of power loss, no battery issues. The circuit that ran the cab lights tested fine. My watch kept time again without skips. That afternoon, I walked among the trees, touching bark, brushing leaves aside. I couldn't shake the feeling I'd driven over some threshold, even if it was just for those minutes. I finished the spraying by moonlight a few nights later, but I kept that section of the orchard till last. I didn't want to be out there again after dark, trying to chase down what had happened. When I finally turned off the tractor and climbed down, the shadows were just shadows, and the air sang with crickets. I stepped into the cab one last time, flicked on the lights, and drove out toward home. Watch set to the right time, engine humming, the orchard behind me steady and unafraid. I was driving west on Highway 50 through eastern Colorado, well past midnight. The moon had set hours earlier, leaving the sky a deep navy, littered with stars. It was late August, but the night air was crisp, about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'd cracked the windows a bit. The engine hummed at a steady 65, and I'd passed just a handful of trucks since leaving Lehman 2 hours ago. Around 1:45 a.m., I glanced up at the sky, trying to spot Orion's belt. I was counting constellations, killing time, when I noticed something odd. I had already driven maybe 20 miles since I last checked the sky, but the stars hadn't shifted. The familiar curve of Cassiopeia was still at the same angle. The Big Dipper hadn't dipped. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe I'd dozed off for a few minutes, but when I looked again, nothing had changed. I slowed the car to 50 and watched the side road markers slide past. The horizon to my left, barely more than grassland and a few scrub oaks, should have shifted relative to the stars, but the stars and landscape stayed locked in place, like a fixed image behind a windshield. My heart rate picked up. I keyed the mic on CB, channel 19. Anybody out there? Static. Sure could use company. Still nothing but hissing hiss. I gripped the wheel and drove another 5 miles, trying to shake it off. But every time I glanced up, the same star pattern hung in the same spot. No rotation, no drift. I thought maybe I'd pulled onto a hidden frontage road and gone in circles, but the mileposts kept counting down logically. At 2:15, I pulled over at a turnout just past milepost 213. The road was deserted, not even a guardrail, just gravel and a shallow drainage ditch. I killed the engine and turned off the headlights. Darkness dropped so thick it felt like velvet. I stepped out, phone in hand, but screen blank, no signal. I leaned against the hood and stared upward. The air was silent except for distant crickets and the hum of the idling engine echo in my ears. The stars flickered bright. I waited. 1 minute, then 2. Every celestial fixture stayed exactly where it had been. A cold breeze drifted across the plains, rustling the grass. The thought of turning around crossed my mind, but I felt too uncertain to move. I needed to see something else. That's when I noticed the puddle. I'd left my floor mat out to air dry, and overnight rain had filled the shallow ditch with a couple inches of water. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky above. I knelt and shone my phone's flashlight on the water. The stars were mirrored there. Yes, but they moved. I watched the puddle's reflection shift slowly, almost imperceptibly. The 3 stars of Orion slid westward across the mirror surface at the pace I expected them to cross the real sky, but the actual sky stayed fixed. Both images, real and puddle, remained in perfect focus. The reflected stars marched against the still backdrop of the real ones. I pressed a fingertip to the surface. A ripple erased part of the reflection. I let the water calm, and the reflected stars reformed in new positions, farther along their path. My breath caught. I slapped at my sleeve and blinked, but it was real. The real sky and its inverted twin were decoupled. One stood motionless, the other moved on its own schedule. I felt a weight in my chest, a nausea. I backed away from the puddle and turned in the dark, scanning the horizon. No lights, no shapes. Just a silent prairie under a frozen sky. I thought, maybe it's a trick of my eyes. But every time I closed them, the internal image of moving stars hovered in my mind. When I opened my eyes, the real sky was as steady as a photograph. I stepped back into the car and locked the doors. The engine fired on the first crank. I backed off the turnout slowly, still watching in the rear view as the puddle reflected the stars tracing their arc. I pulled back onto the highway and drove east, headlights cutting through darkness. The regular hum of the engine felt reassuring. My phone found signal again around milepost 208. 1 bar, enough for a call. I thought about calling someone, but I couldn't think what I'd say that wouldn't sound insane. By the time I reached Le Mans, the real sky had begun to move. The stars that had held the same position were now creeping west like the rest. I pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and sat for 10 minutes, engine idling, watching the sky. The puddle reflection was gone back on the plains, replaced by dry gravel. When I finally drove home, the sky was paling. Dawn was coming. I drove the rest of the way in silence, not touching the radio. I pulled into my driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a long moment in the pastel light, wondering which sky was real and which was the echo. I woke up to a tap, tap, tap on the driver's side window. It was just after 2 in the morning, and I'd been dozing in my van, parked at a pullout off County Road 7. The wind had been rattling the side mirrors for a while, so at first I thought it was just a loose branch. Then the tapping came again, this time against the sliding door window, slower, deliberate. Tap, tap. I sat up in the driver's seat and blinked at the dark. My phone clock glowed 2:13. The cab was silent, except for my own breathing. No wind on the window now, just that steady tapping. I held my breath and peered through the side window, but I couldn't see anything. Just blackness and the faint outline of trees beyond the headlight's reach. Tap, tap. I clicked on the dome light, but the bulb sputtered and went out. I reached for my headlamp on the dash, flipped it on, and swept the beam across the exterior. No one there. The gravel beside the van was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of a person. I exhaled, a little too loud, and shut off the light. That's when it happened. Every door lock engaged with a single clunk. Driver's door, passenger door, sliding door, rear doors, all locked as if by remote. My heart thumped. I hit the unlock button on the key fob. Nothing. I tried the manual lock on the driver's door. It wouldn't move. The other windows were sealed tight too. I sat frozen, ears straining. The tapping had stopped. Outside, the world was still. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves. I flicked off the headlamp and pulled the shades covering the windshield. I needed darkness. I didn't want anything seeing in. My phone was dead, battery drained. I'd forgotten to plug it in after dinner. I pressed the power button anyway. Black screen. No service. No signal. I considered kicking out a window, but the glass was too thick, tinted, and locked. I sank back into the seat and tried to calm down. I keep a small knife in the glove box. I thought about using it to pry the lock, but something made me hesitate. I didn't want to risk making noise. Then, just as suddenly as the tapping began, I heard something else, a faint shh sound, like breath, against the outside of the windshield. Not a wind hiss, something closer, warmer. I pressed my forehead to the glass, heart pounding, and wiped away a small patch of fog. There was nothing there, no face, no handprints. Yet the glass felt colder where I'd touched it. The fog on the outside had to have come from somewhere. My breath couldn't reach it from inside the van. The windshield was covered in gray-white condensation, except for the small circle I'd wiped clean. My pulse raced. I stared at the cleared spot, expecting to see something materialize in the mist, letters scrawled, a shape pressed against the glass, anything. But it stayed empty. The fog quivered like a membrane. I pressed my ear against the cool glass. Nothing but distant frogs. Maybe a truck on the highway 2 miles away. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, listening to my breathing, waiting for more sounds. The night felt vast and empty, but I knew something had been pressing against the van. I thought about the road behind me, too far for anyone to travel in silence, especially on fresh gravel. At some point, the door locks clicked again, all four unlatching. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I waited another few seconds, eyes darting around, then unlocked the driver's door. The outside air was cold, damp, and smelled like pine and soil. My boots crunched on the frost-hardened gravel as I stepped out and circled the van. I looked for footprints, shadows, anything off. The woods beyond were dark, trees skeletal in the headlamp's glow. No one crouched behind the wheel well. No footprints led to the back of the van, only my own scattered tire impressions and my boots' prints from that circle around the van. I checked the windshield, now completely clear, as if the fog had evaporated. No smear where I'd wiped it, no droplets trickling down, just glass reflecting the low moon. I climbed back inside, heart still pounding, and closed the door. I leaned back in my seat, hands resting on the wheel, trying to slow my breathing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stared out at the road until the sky lightened a pale gray. By dawn, everything looked normal. I unlocked the doors one by one, slid open the side door, and stepped onto the frost-glazed pullout for the day. No claw marks, no message scrawled in fog, no sign that anything had touched the van. I drove home slowly, windshield wipers clearing fresh drizzle, mind replaying the tapping and that breathy shh across the glass. Ever since, I parked my van only in front of my house, under the streetlight. Whenever I leave for a trip, I bring my phone charger everywhere. I haven't camped in it again at night. We were camping out in the Rockies near Estes Park. just me and Jenna, trying to get away from the city noise for a couple days. It was late June, so the nights were cool but not freezing, and the sky was clear. We'd picked a spot just off one of the less traveled trails, where the trees thinned out near the edge of a steep canyon. The kind of place where the wind usually sings through the pines and the crickets don't shut up all night. We'd set up the tent around dusk, cooked some burgers over the campfire, and drank a couple beers while watching the stars come out. Pretty normal, honestly. I was getting used to the quiet, or so I thought. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I'm not sure what pulled me out of sleep, but it wasn't the usual noises. In fact, there weren't any noises at all. I blinked a few times and sat up in the tent, looking around. The air felt still. No wind rustling the tent's rainfly, no distant calls from animals, no crickets, no frogs, not even the soft hum of insects. Even Jenna was silent. It was like someone had turned off every sound in the world except the beating of my own heart. But weirdly, even my breathing felt muted, like I couldn't hear it at all. I nudged Jenna. "Hey, you awake?" I whispered. She opened her eyes slowly, looking as confused as I felt. "Yeah. What's going on? I don't hear anything." We both sat there, listening with our eyes, but the silence was complete. I mean, complete. Like the air itself was holding its breath. After a minute or two, the silence was broken by this sharp, clear whistling note. It wasn't a sound you'd expect in the middle of the forest, more like a pure, musical tone, perfectly steady, just one note, echoing across the canyon like someone had blown a long whistle from way up on the cliff face. The note hung there for maybe 5 or 6 seconds, then faded out completely. And just like that, all the sounds came back like someone flipped a switch. The wind picked up, rattling the tent's zipper. Crickets started up their chirping. A distant owl hooted, and even Jenna exhaled, breaking the silence. We looked at each other, both wide-eyed. I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 2:17 a.m. I kept expecting to hear something else, some explanation for that strange quiet and the note, but there was nothing. Just normal nighttime sounds. Neither of us could say much. I wanted to get out of the tent, see if anything was out there, but something about the sudden stillness had me frozen. Jenna finally said, "Maybe it was some kind of weird wind thing, like when the air pressure changes or something?" I didn't know. It felt wrong, like the forest was holding itself back for a moment, and that note was a signal or a release of something hidden. We stayed inside the tent after that. Neither of us could sleep again, not with the memory of that silence and the whistle pressing in our ears. The next morning, the forest looked normal. Birds were busy, bugs everywhere, wind playing through the leaves. Nothing out of place. We packed up and left, but that silence stayed with me, that empty, unnatural quiet that made everything else sound like it had been a distant dream. I still wonder what we heard that night, or didn't hear, really, and why everything came back so suddenly afterward. I was out in the barn around 4:30 a.m., like I always am before the sun comes up. I usually get up early to check on the animals before the heat hits, especially in July when it's already pushing 80 degrees by mid-morning. This summer, though, something happened that I still can't explain. I live on a small farm in southern Ohio, about 10 minutes from town. Nothing fancy, just a few acres, some cattle, chickens, a couple horses, and the old barn where I keep the hay and feed. The barn's been there longer than I have. It's made of weathered wood, and the kind that creaks and groans no matter what the wind's doing. It's not big, but it's solid. Anyway, that morning started out normal. I'd been up for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the weather report on the radio. They said there was a cold front moving in, but it wouldn't reach us until later. No storms or anything. The sky was still dark when I grabbed my flashlight and headed out the back door. The air was humid, like it usually is before dawn in the summer. The crickets were still chirping, and a few owls were hooting somewhere behind the trees. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting the animals settled and making sure the water troughs were full. When I got close to the barn, I stopped. The whole place was glowing blue from the inside. Not a soft light. More like someone had shoved a giant blue lantern in there. The kind of light that makes shadows sharp and colors look off. It didn't blink or flicker, just sat there steady. I thought maybe one of the lights I'd left plugged in had shorted or something. But the barn's old wiring isn't like that. It's mostly off-grid. I keep my electric tools in the shed, and the barn just has a single old bulb, which I never turn on unless I'm working in there. And I was pretty sure I hadn't left anything running. Still, the blue glow was weird enough that I walked up to the big sliding door to check. The animals were quiet, dead silent. That's the first thing I noticed. Normally the cattle would be lowing or shifting around in their pens. The horses would be stomping, snorting, or nickering. Even the chickens usually cluck or scratch at the dirt. But that morning, not a sound, just silence. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand was on the wood, and I felt that heat you get when the sun's just about to come up, except the sun wasn't up yet. The air was still cool. The blue light gave everything an eerie glow, like the barn wasn't part of this world anymore. I slid the door open. The moment the door moved, the light vanished, like someone flipped a switch off. The barn went completely dark except for the soft gray of dawn starting outside. I called out softly to the animals. Nothing. I stepped in, shining my flashlight around. The animals were all huddled in the far corner, pressed together tight. The cows stood still, their eyes wide and dark in the beam. The horses didn't move. The chickens had dropped their heads and were crouched low. Not one of them made a noise. I moved closer, calling to them, but they didn't react. It felt like they were holding their breath. I spent maybe 20 minutes in there, trying to calm them down, making sure everything was okay. I double-checked the water and feed, everything normal. No sign of anything unusual, except the animals were still strangely quiet and clustered together. I closed the door and left the barn without looking back. I've checked that barn 100 times since then. Never saw the blue light again. The animals acted normal the rest of the day, eating and wandering around like nothing had happened. But I never opened that barn door at night after that. I don't know why. Something about it felt off, like the barn wasn't just a barn that night, like it had become something else for a moment, something I wasn't supposed to see. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or weird stuff. I just know what I saw. The blue light, the silence, the animals pressed together like they were scared of something I couldn't see. That's it. No flashes in the sky, no strange sounds or smells, just that cold blue glow and a quiet that didn't belong. I keep telling myself it was maybe a reflection or some kind of electrical issue, but no electrician or neighbor has been able to explain it. The wiring's fine. The whole barn is old wood and nails. No metal surfaces for reflections like that. It's one of those things that just happened and then stopped, like it was waiting for me to see it. I don't know if it means anything or if it was just some random flicker of the world being a little stranger than I thought. All I know is I haven't been near that barn after dark since, and I probably never will again. It was late March when me and my buddy Jared did the trip out to Big Bend. He'd just finished a season up in Utah doing trail maintenance, and I had a week off between jobs. We weren't doing anything intense, just a 3-day backpack loop through part of the Chisos Mountains and into the desert flats. We started early in the day, sky totally clear. I remember the ranger at the visitor center telling us to keep an eye on the forecast since spring storms could roll in fast, but everything looked bone dry. Bright sun, low 80s, that kind of still heat that makes sound feel far away. We took the outer mountain loop, moving pretty slow since we hadn't hiked together in a while. First day was normal. We camped near a dry wash and talked about nothing, made some instant chili, and watched satellites crawl across the sky. Second day was when it happened. We were maybe 5 hours in, coming down from the south rim and dropping into the flatter desert where the trail threads through these long ridges. It's scrubby out there. Mesquite, yucca, low grass. Visibility's wide open except where the hills cut the horizon. At some point that afternoon, Jared stopped mid-step and pointed up toward the ridge on our right. There was something shiny up there, maybe a quarter mile away, just above the skyline. It was small, kind of silvery, oval-shaped, no sound, no movement, not at first. He thought it might be a drone. I said maybe someone was surveying, but there were no obvious wings, no props, no blinking lights, Just this silent thing hanging there. It looked smooth, polished. We kept walking, not really worried, just watching it out of the corners of our eyes. After a few minutes, Jared said, "Is it following us?" I laughed, but then I stopped and looked harder. It was moving now. Not fast, but definitely keeping pace with us, maybe 50 feet above the ridgeline. When we stopped, it stopped. I tested it, walked forward 5 paces. It slid forward. Stopped again. It froze. We tried waving at it. Nothing. Just that same quiet, motionless hovering. No wind, just the dry buzz of the desert. Jared got out his phone, tried to zoom in and get a video, but the screen kept glitching, weird lines across the image like digital noise. The thing itself barely showed up. Just a blur. I tried my phone too. Same result. At one point I said maybe it was a reflection off a rock or something. He shook his head and said, "Nah, man, that thing's moving with us. Look." And it was. Every turn we made, it mirrored. If we paused for too long, it would slowly drift to a new position, always keeping the same distance, the same angle. We didn't really talk much for the next hour. We were both trying not to freak each other out, I think. The trail dipped into a shallow ravine, and for a while we couldn't see the ridge. I kept looking over my shoulder. When we came back up and crested the next low hill, the ridge it had been above was now behind us. The object was gone. We scanned the sky, the surrounding hills, everything. Nothing. Just empty blue. Jared thought maybe it had gone behind one of the far buttes to the south, but we couldn't tell. We pushed on a few more miles and made camp near a patch of low trees. The sun was setting, pink and orange across the rocks, and everything felt normal again for a while. We made dinner and didn't talk about it much, like we were trying to put some distance between us and the weirdness. That night, I woke up just after 2. No sound. No wind. Jared was still asleep. I don't know what made me sit up, but I remember the air feeling heavy, like the sky had gotten lower. I stepped out of the tent. Everything looked normal. Stars out, moon low, desert dead still. Then I noticed something weird in the distance, a faint glow, maybe a mile off, too low to be moonlight on the rocks. It pulsed faintly, not bright, just there. I thought about waking Jared, but I just stood there and watched it. It didn't move. It wasn't shaped like the object from earlier, not as sharp or distinct, more like a light with no source. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes. Then it just faded out, like turning down a dimmer switch. Next morning, Jared asked if I'd heard anything weird. I said no. He said he had a dream that we were being watched. I didn't bring up the light. We finished the loop that day. No more signs of the object. Phones worked fine again. Compass didn't act up. Everything went back to normal. We don't really talk about it now. Not because it was terrifying, exactly. It wasn't. It just didn't fit anywhere. I've hiked all over the Southwest and I've seen weird stuff, distant flashes, weird animal calls, even those silent white aircraft you sometimes catch near testing ranges. But this was different. It felt aware, like it wasn't there until we were. And when we tried to find it again, it was already gone. I got to Lake Ogallala around 4:45 that morning. It was late May, still cold enough to see your breath, but calm, real still. No wind, not even bird chatter yet. Just that kind of quiet you only get when you're the first person awake for miles. I parked in the little gravel pull-off near the west end of the lake, where the trees thin out and there's that old wood bench down by the shore. Nobody else was there, no other cars. I was hoping for trout. I had my thermos, tackle, the whole setup. Just planned to sit for a few hours and fish until the sun got high. Didn't even make it to my first cast. I'd barely walked halfway down to the water when I noticed something up in the sky that didn't look right. At first I figured it was just one of those low fog banks you get around the lake when it's cold. It looked like a flat-bottomed cloud, not big, maybe the size of a barn from where I stood. Pale gray, kind of wispy around the edges. It was hovering maybe a couple 100 feet above the far side of the lake, out near the bend where the trees curve in. I didn't think much of it at first. I set my stuff down and poured some coffee, but I kept glancing at it because it wasn't drifting. Clouds move, even on still mornings, but this thing just stayed put. Dead center above the water, didn't even wobble. Then I noticed it was turning, slowly, like a lazy rotation, counterclockwise. You wouldn't catch it unless you stared for a good 30 seconds. That's how slow it was. But it was definitely rotating. That's when I started getting a weird feeling. Not scared exactly, but my stomach went cold. Something about it didn't sit right. I pulled out my little handheld radio, the weather band kind, and flipped it on just to hear something. It buzzed to life, static and bits of a forecast coming through. Then this low sound came underneath the voice, like a subwoofer hum. Barely audible, but low enough I felt it in my ribs. I thought it was feedback or a glitch in the signal. I switched channels. The hum followed. Changed frequencies again. Same thing. Always under the static like it was coming from outside the radio. Just this steady, vibrating tone that seemed to rise and fall real slow, like breathing. I looked back at the lake. The surface, which had been lightly rippling, was glass now. Not a single ring, not even from bugs. Then I realized no fish were surfacing. Not one. That part really messed with me, because even on the slowest mornings, you see something. A little splash, a circle here or there, but this, nothing. Like the lake had gone to sleep. That hum kept going. Not louder, just deeper. I don't know how else to describe it. It made my molars feel itchy. I stood there holding my coffee and radio, not moving. I couldn't even bring myself to unzip the tackle bag. I just stared across the water at this rotating, hovering thing and listened to that low tone shake through the trees. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 10. Long enough for the sun to peek over the ridge behind me and catch the edge of that thing in the sky. When the sunlight hit it, it didn't light up like a cloud. It didn't even change color. It just sort of shimmered like heat off asphalt and then gone. Not like it zipped away, just blinked out. 1 second it was there, slowly turning, and the next it wasn't. Like someone flipped off a projector. The hum stopped at the same time, just cut out. My radio clicked back to normal static and the tail end of some weather report. I looked down at the lake again, and a second later, plop, fish surfaced. Little circles started rippling out all over. I don't know what I saw. I didn't fish that morning. I poured out my coffee, zipped everything back up, and walked straight back to the truck. I didn't even tell anyone until about a year later. I just stopped going to that part of the lake. Me and Kyle used to go out to this big patch of desert just past Gold Butte Road south of Mesquite. Not really marked or anything, just a dirt turnout with a half-burned couch and some old tire tracks that vanish into scrub. We went out there a lot the summer after graduation, mostly to fly his drone and get high and screw around. It was stupid hot that day, like 105, but we didn't care. We brought gas station burritos and a giant cooler full of Mountain Dew and ice. Kyle had just installed this new high-range antenna booster on his drone. It's supposed to give it a better signal up to 3 miles, even with terrain. He was psyched to try it out. We parked the truck on the hard dirt near the brush line and set everything up on the tailgate. Around 4:30 p.m., sun just starting to dip, but still bright enough to fry your skin. The sky was totally cloudless, wind was dead still. Kyle launched the drone while I sat in the bed eating my burrito. He had the goggles on, doing his usual commentary. Coming up over the ridge, hot damn, that's a jackrabbit down there, that kind of stuff. He was flying maybe 800 feet up, slow and wide toward the hills. About 20 minutes in, I heard him go, what's that? I looked up at him. He was frozen with the controller in one hand, tilting his head like he was trying to line up a better view through the goggles. What? I asked. There's something up there. Just sitting. It's not a plane. I hopped off the bed and shielded my eyes. The drone itself was too high to spot, but I couldn't see anything else in the sky either. Just blue. Kyle kept watching for another minute, then said, "It's not moving. At all. Like it's glued there." "How high?" He didn't answer, just cursed under his breath. "Hold on." I'm pointing the camera at it. Then the drone feed cut out. The goggles went black. The tablet screen showed signal lost. The drone controller started beeping like crazy. Kyle yanked the goggles off and stared at the screen, tapping buttons. It just shit. It bricked out, like right when I aimed at it. We both scanned the sky, trying to see if the drone was falling, but there was nothing. Just the quiet. No wind, no bugs. Even the distant highway noise was gone. Maybe it just dropped behind something. I said. You got a return signal? He tried reconnecting, powering down, powering back up. Nothing. It was like the drone had vanished. But the GPS map still showed the last position, hovering just past the edge of a ridge, due east. We got back in the truck and drove toward the coordinates, bouncing over ruts and dodging bushes. The terrain out there is rough, little canyons, dry washes, all that. It took us maybe 15 minutes to get to where it said the drone was last seen. There was nothing, not a shred of it. We climbed the ridge and scanned everything. We walked maybe half a mile in a circle, no drone, no wreckage, just dry dirt and rocks. The weirdest part was how quiet it still was. No birds, no planes overhead, not even a breeze. Just this low, weird pressure in the air, like when you're underwater and your ears won't pop. Kyle finally gave up and called it. Battery's probably dead by now anyway. We headed back just as the sun hit the horizon. Colors were intense, all red and orange, but it felt off. Like the shadows weren't falling right. I can't explain it. Everything looked normal, but felt wrong, like a set. We didn't say much on the drive back to town. I could tell Kyle was pissed. That drone wasn't cheap, but I also think he was freaked out. Back at his place, we pulled the SD card from the goggles and plugged it into his laptop to review the flight footage. First 20 minutes were all there. Hills, brush, some cool overhead shots. Then the last few seconds before the signal cut. The drone tilts slightly, starts to pan upward, and the sky is empty. Nothing. Not even a bird or a glare or a flicker. Kyle scrubbed the footage back and forth like 20 times, muttering, no way," under his breath. He swore up and down there'd been something there. I believed him. I saw his reaction in real time. He wasn't faking it. But whatever he saw didn't show up on the footage. It's like it wasn't reflecting light, or the camera just didn't register it. Or maybe it was never there, and something else messed with the drone. Either way, we never found the drone. Kyle ordered a replacement a month later, but never flew out there again. Neither did I. I was 16, living in a small town out in Central Oregon, where the sky at night is so dark it almost hurts your eyes. My dad got me a decent camera for my birthday, and I got into long exposure photography. I wanted to capture stars, the Milky Way, whatever was up there. It felt like the best way to chase something quiet and big, something I couldn't touch but could still see. One Friday night in early September, I set up my tripod in the backyard. It was cool, maybe low 40s, but dry. The moon was just a sliver, barely bright enough to wash out any stars. I knew it was a good night for shooting. I had a few batteries, extra SD cards, and my hoodie zipped up tight because the wind picked up now and then. I aimed the camera toward the north, where the sky was clearest. I'd done long exposure shots before, usually 30 seconds, sometimes a minute, to get the star trails. This time I was trying a new setting, 3 minutes per shot. I was trying to capture more detail, longer trails, and maybe catch some of that faint light pollution from the town in the distance. I set the timer and sat back on the grass, looking up. The stars were so bright and sharp, it felt like I could reach out and grab one. I was thinking about how small we all are, just blinking dots on a blue ball spinning in space. I was feeling peaceful. After the first shot finished, I checked the image on the camera's screen. The star trails were perfect, a smooth arc, and everything looked normal. I clicked for a second shot. The camera counted down and snapped again, then a third. I took 5 shots in total. After the last one, I packed the camera back into my backpack and went inside to look at them on my laptop. At first glance, the photos looked exactly like I expected. Stars moving in smooth curves across black. Then, I noticed the 4th shot was weird. In the middle of the frame, cutting through the star trails, was a bright, straight beam of light. It looked like someone had shined a giant flashlight straight down from the sky. The beam was sharp-edged, pure white, and stretched all the way from the top of the frame to the bottom. I blinked a few times, zoomed in, zoomed out. The beam wasn't in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 5th shots, just that 1/4 photo. The other frames were taken with the same settings, from the same spot, just a few minutes apart. I went back outside and looked up. The sky was clear again, the stars just as bright as before. No weird light beams. I checked around for anything that might have caused it. A flashlight, a spotlight, a drone with a searchlight, but nothing. The house was quiet, my parents asleep inside. The next morning, I asked my best friend, Mara, if she wanted to see the photos. She's the kind of person who believes in weird stuff, so I thought she might have some explanation. When I showed her the beam, she said maybe it was a meteor or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, but meteors don't usually show up as perfect straight beams in long exposures. They streak, sure, but not like a solid pillar. Later that day, I searched online for anything similar. I found a few people talking about unexplained lights caught on cameras, but nothing that quite matched what I saw. A lot of the pictures were blurry or grainy, or the light looked like a flash or flare. Mine was crisp, like it was really there, but only for that exact exposure. That night, I went back outside with the camera. I set it up in the same spot, same settings, hoping maybe I'd catch it again. I took 10 photos in a row. Nothing. Just normal star trails. I started feeling weird about the whole thing. Like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. But it wasn't scary exactly, just strange and out of place. About a week later, I was at school and told my science teacher, Mr. Carlson, about it. He's into astrophysics and photography, so I figured he might have a clue. He looked at the photo on my phone and frowned. "That's odd," he said. "That kind of beam doesn't line up with any known celestial events. No satellites or planes flying like that either." He said maybe it was a glitch in the sensor or a reflection inside the lens. But if it was a lens flare or sensor defect, why didn't it show up in any other frame? And why was it so perfectly vertical? It didn't make sense. I kept thinking about the photo all the time, especially when I was outside alone at night. I felt like something was watching or waiting. One night, about 2 weeks after I took the original photos, I was out in the backyard again. I didn't bring the camera this time, just sat on the grass, staring up. The wind was almost still, the sky darker than ever. Suddenly, I saw a faint glow in the northern sky, the same area I'd aimed the camera. It was subtle, a light that pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. It wasn't moving, not like a plane or satellite, just hovering. I squinted and focused, but it vanished within seconds. I wasn't sure if I really saw it or if my eyes were playing tricks. The next day, I looked through the rest of my photos from that first night. There was nothing else unusual besides that one beam. No other lights, no shadows, no shapes. But the strangest thing was that the timestamp on the photo with the beam was off by exactly 5 minutes. The camera clock was correct on every other file, but on that one shot, the time was 5 minutes later than it should have been. I double-checked the settings and metadata. No sign of manipulation or error. I asked my dad if he'd ever noticed the clock on the camera acting weird. He said no. It was like time shifted just for that one exposure. After that, I stopped trying to photograph the night sky. I didn't want to chase something I couldn't understand or control. Sometimes when I'm outside and the sky is clear, I still look up at that same patch of stars. I wonder if the beam was some kind of signal or just a freak accident of light and time. I never saw anything like it again. No beams, no hovering lights, just a single photo out of hundreds showing something I still can't explain. I was flying a routine cargo run from Denver to Salt Lake City. Nothing special, just the usual early morning flight over the Rockies, cruising at about 24,000 feet in my little turboprop. The sky was clear and the weather was calm, perfect for flying. I had my route planned out on the GPS, checked my instruments, and everything was working as expected. I remember taking off at 5:15 a.m., leaving the ground crew behind as I climbed steadily. The sunrise was just starting to paint the horizon with orange and pink, and I was enjoying the quiet hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the flight. About 30 minutes in, I was settled, radioed in my position to air traffic control, and checked the instruments again. All normal. Then, at some point during the flight, I realized something was off. I was glancing at the clock, which I always keep near my instrument panel, and it was showing 6:45 a.m. That didn't make sense. I'd been flying for a little over an hour, but my GPS and onboard flight log were telling me something different. According to them, it was only 6:30 a.m., and my flight time showed about 45 minutes elapsed since takeoff. I double-checked everything. The altimeter, the GPS, the engine readings, they all showed normal operation. No fluctuations, no warnings, no dips in fuel pressure or engine temperature. The autopilot was still engaged, keeping me on the plotted course right over the mountain range. But the clocks, the one mounted on the instrument panel, was 15 minutes ahead of the GPS clock and the system's internal timer. I reset my watch against the plane's clock before takeoff, so I knew it had to be right. Yet here I was, watching two different times that didn't line up, and I couldn't explain it. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe it was a glitch with the clock on the panel or some kind of electrical interference from the radio, but the strange part was that everything else matched the GPS perfectly. My location, speed, altitude, they all synced with the GPS time. It was just the clock that was fast. I tried to keep my focus, but the mismatch bothered me more than it should have. I was an experienced pilot, and I knew how critical timing was for flights, especially when you're crossing air traffic zones and keeping in touch with ATC. I radioed them to confirm my position, and they reported no traffic or issues in the area. When I checked the weather radar, everything was clear. No storms or turbulence. The plane was steady, and the engine was humming smoothly. I started running mental checks on my instruments. Nothing was malfunctioning. I even flipped the circuit breakers for the panel clock to reset it, but when I turned them back on, the clock was still 15 minutes ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I had no way to fix it or confirm what exactly. Then I noticed something else. Looking out the window on my right side, the mountain peaks below had started to look different. They were shrouded in a thin mist, unusual for the time of year, and I saw a strange, diffuse light glowing faintly over one ridge. It was too early for fog at that altitude, and the light wasn't coming from the sun. It was soft, almost like a low, pulsing glow that didn't move, just hovered above the trees. I reached for the binoculars in the side compartment to get a better look, but before I could, the light vanished, like someone switched it off. The mist stayed for a moment, then it cleared as quickly as it had come. I glanced at my instruments again. The clock still showed 6:45, GPS and flight log still at 6:30. I made a mental note to check everything again once I landed. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the strange time discrepancy lingered in the back of my mind. When I touched down in Salt Lake City, my watch said was 6:50 a.m. The flight log said I'd been flying for 1 hour and 15 minutes. According to my calculations, based on takeoff and the actual time on my watch, it should have been closer to an hour. I went through the post-flight checks, filled out the paperwork, and talked with the ground crew. I mentioned the strange light over the mountains, but none of them had seen or heard anything unusual that morning. The flight data recorder and the plane's maintenance logs showed nothing out of the ordinary. No unexpected detours, no changes in altitude or speed, no system errors or warnings. I pulled the GPS track from the flight, and the route was perfectly straight, exactly as I'd flown it, with no deviations. Still, the missing 15 minutes bothered me. I asked a couple of fellow pilots if they'd ever experienced anything like that, but no one had. Some joked about time glitches or pilot fatigue messing with perception, but I hadn't been tired. And it wasn't just feeling like time was different, it was documented by the clocks in the flight log. A few days later, I pulled the GPS data and my flight logs up again side by side. The timestamps on the GPS showed the plane over that section of mountains 15 minutes later than my watch, and the panel clock said. It was as if the plane had skipped ahead on the GPS's internal time, or my watch and panel clock had jumped forward. No one else had a record of this. Air traffic control logs showed I was reporting on time at expected intervals. There was no delay or gap in communication. I thought maybe the plane had a clock syncing issue, but everything else lined up with GPS time, except the panel clock and my watch. It was like time itself had briefly fractured for me in the cockpit. Later, I checked weather reports and radar images for that morning, looking for anything unusual near the mountains. Storms, electromagnetic disturbances, anything that could cause instrument issues. Nothing. I told my girlfriend about it when I got home. She just looked at me funny, like I was describing a sci-fi movie plot. Maybe I was. Weeks passed and I kept flying the same route, but I never saw that strange light again. I never had the time discrepancy either. Sometimes, when I'm reviewing old flights or checking GPS logs, I'll notice that little 15-minute gap in my mind, like a missing piece I can't fit in anywhere. I don't know what happened that morning. All the data says I flew a perfectly normal flight, but my own experience says otherwise. It's like I lost 15 minutes somewhere over those mountains with no sign of detour, no sign of malfunction, and no explanation. Just a quiet sky, a faint light, and time slipping through my fingers. We were about 5 miles in, up near Cherokee National Forest, eastern Tennessee. Mid-October, sunny and cold. Leaves were just past peak, and the trail was scattered with reds and yellows that stuck to your boots when they got wet. It was me, Josh, and Alex, guys I'd hiked with plenty of times before. We weren't doing anything extreme, just a 2-night loop, enough to get away from work and phones and noise. The plan was simple: camp at Buckhorn the first night, cross over Ridge Gap the second, then come back down by the Fire Road. Weather had held steady all week, no rain in the forecast, and we made good time the first day. I remember we reached the old fire tower around 4, just before sunset, and climbed up to watch the light change. That part was normal. It was the second day when things got weird. We'd left camp around 9 a.m., aiming to make it over the ridge by early afternoon. The climb up was slow but steady. Josh was fiddling with his GPS the whole time, trying to track our pace, and Alex kept checking a paper map he'd laminated back home. I trusted them both. They were detail guys, always triple-checking bearings and coordinates. At one point, we hit a fork that wasn't on the map. Not unusual. Trails shift, signs fall, but both routes looked well-worn, and there were no blazes. Josh wanted to backtrack and find a clearer junction. Alex thought the left path looked more promising, judging by slope and direction. I pulled out my compass to get a better sense of our heading. That was the first strange moment. The needle spun, not wildly, not fast, just this slow, steady turn, like it couldn't decide on north. I tapped the face, thinking maybe it had gotten bumped in my pack. It kept turning. I held it still in my palm, still spinning. No stutter, no wobble, just a slow rotation that didn't stop. I called the others over. Josh took out his compass. Same thing, spinning. Alex's did it too, but slower. His was older, a metal-based Silva he'd had since high school. We all just stood there for a minute, holding our gear out like idiots. It was completely quiet. No wind, no rustling. I remember noticing that, how still it was. Usually you hear birds or squirrels in the brush, something, but this was dead silent. Josh started pacing in a circle, holding his compass out like a dowsing rod. It spun the same way no matter where he went. We checked our phones, no signal, which wasn't surprising, but even the GPS app on Josh's phone couldn't find a fix. It just showed a blinking dot drifting around like we were floating in the ocean. We kept moving. No one said it directly, but I think we were trying to walk out of whatever this was. Maybe some mineral pocket under the ground was messing with magnetics. I've heard of stuff like that. But it wasn't just the compasses. After a few minutes, I started feeling pressure in my ears, like descending in an airplane, but slower, thicker. I tried to pop them, but it didn't help. I asked the others if they felt it. Josh said yeah, like being underwater. Alex nodded, but didn't say much after that. He looked pale. The trees started thinning as we walked, but not in the usual way. It wasn't that the forest opened up. It was more like the space between things had stretched. The distance between trees felt wrong, like a picture where someone widened the middle just enough to mess with your eyes. I stepped off the trail to pee and noticed the ground was dry as powder, even though we'd walked through dew that morning. I squatted down and picked up a handful. It crumbled like dust. No smell, no dampness, just dry, brittle earth. We passed through the strange patch in maybe 20 minutes. On the far side, the compasses stopped spinning. They didn't snap back to north. They just kind of slowed, then settled. The air felt normal again. Sound came back. Birds, wind, the usual forest hum. We didn't say much after that. Everyone seemed off. Josh checked his GPS again. It worked now, but it said we were about a quarter-mile south of where we should have been. Not a huge difference, but weird considering we'd walked a straight line, and the terrain hadn't changed that much. We made camp early that night, just before sunset. Nobody wanted to hike in the dark. We sat around the fire, cooked ramen, didn't talk much. I brought up the spinning compasses again, but Josh waved it off. Probably some freak magnetic pocket, he said. Alex didn't answer. He just stared into the fire and drank his instant coffee. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to pee, crawled out of my bag, and stepped away from the tent. The moon was out, but the light was thin. I went maybe 20 feet off to the side of our site and noticed something odd with the trees. They weren't swaying in the wind, they were vibrating, gently, like the motion you see when heat rises off asphalt, except it was the actual trunks, just a slight shimmer. I stared at them for a while, not sure if I was fully awake. Then I heard this high-pitched whine. Distant, not painful, but constant. I turned around and looked toward camp. Josh's tent was zipped up. Alex's wasn't. The flap was open. I whispered his name. No response. Walked over and looked inside. He was there, eyes open, just lying still. I asked if he was okay. He blinked once, then slowly pulled the sleeping bag up to his chin. Next morning, he acted normal. Made coffee, packed up, didn't say anything about the night before. I wanted to ask him if he'd heard the sound or seen the trees, but something told me not to. Josh didn't mention anything either, so maybe it was just me. We finished the loop that day. Weather held, trail was clear. When we got back to the car, I checked my compass again. It pointed north like nothing had ever been wrong. On the drive home, I asked Josh if he'd saved the GPS track. He said yeah, but when he pulled it up later, the section from late morning that second day was just missing. Not a bad signal, just blank. Like it hadn't recorded at all. I kept the compass. Still works. But every now and then, when I take it out of the drawer, the needle starts that slow spin again, just for a few seconds, and then it stops. I usually spend a lot of nights on the roof of my apartment building. It's nothing fancy, just an old bench, some leftover cushions, and my telescope set up to look at the stars. I like the quiet up there. The city noise is muffled, and the sky looks clearer than anywhere else around. I've been into amateur astronomy for years, so it's kind of my thing. This all started on a late September evening. The air was cool, a little crisp, but not cold yet. I'd gotten home from work early around 7 p.m., and after dinner, I hauled my scope up to the roof around 9:30. It was still mostly dark by then, but the stars were out, bright and sharp. I set the telescope to look at Cygnus, the Swan constellation. It's one of my favorites. I'd been tracking it for a while just to see how it moves through the night sky. Usually it shifts slowly, like everything else does, but this time something was off. When I lined up the scope, a star cluster in Cygnus moved, like it wasn't where it was supposed to be. At first I thought maybe I'd messed up the alignment or the coordinates. I double-checked my charts and my equipment. Everything else was in place. The other constellations were exactly where they should be. But that part of Cygnus, a small group of stars near the tail, was shifted about 10 degrees to the west from where it was last time I checked. I stared at it for a while, blinking back and forth between my chart and the telescope's eyepiece. The stars themselves looked perfectly normal, steady, and bright, but the pattern was definitely wrong. I figured maybe it was a weird atmospheric thing or an optical illusion, so I stayed up watching for the next hour or so. The shifted cluster didn't move back. If anything, it stayed roughly in that position, almost like it was stuck. The next morning, I told my friend Leah about it. She's a geology student, not into astronomy, but she humored me. Maybe you're seeing a reflection or some kind of light pollution, she said, but I could tell she was curious. That night, I went back to the roof. It was cloudier than before, the kind of low-hanging fog that makes the city lights glow orange. I still set up the telescope, but I wasn't expecting to see much. About 11 p.m., I noticed a black sedan parked across the street, right under the building. It was just sitting there, engine off, no headlights on. The streetlight overhead barely lit it, but I could see a figure inside. I watched for maybe 10 minutes. The car didn't move. The figure didn't get out. At first I thought maybe it was just someone waiting or parking there for some reason. Then suddenly the passenger side door opened and a man stepped out. He was wearing a dark suit, black tie, black shirt, nothing flashy, and he moved in a way that felt deliberate and almost clinical, like he was on a job. I ducked behind the telescope, but I could see him looking up toward the building. He didn't climb the stairs or come inside. Instead, he pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and aimed it straight up at my telescope's lens. The light wasn't bright enough to blind me, but it caught the lens perfectly, reflecting a dull, greenish glow. I didn't know what to do. I froze for a second. He kept the flashlight aimed for maybe 20 seconds, then suddenly closed it and got back in the car. The door shut quietly. The engine started, and the sedan drove off slowly, disappearing down the street without a sound. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding, wondering if I should go down after him or call someone. But by the time I moved, the street was empty. The next few days were tense. I kept looking out my window, watching for that car or the man. Nothing. But I started feeling this weight, like I was being watched. I kept going up to the roof at night, but the stars didn't look right anymore. That shifted cluster in Cygnus was still off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the whole sky. One night, about a week later, I was packing up to leave the roof when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. I swear I heard someone whispering, but when I looked around, only the wind moved the leaves on the fire escape. I tried to ignore it, but the next day at work, my phone died unexpectedly. Battery at 100% the night before, suddenly dead in the middle of the afternoon. I replaced the battery, but it never held a full charge again. The weirdness kept piling up. Small things that didn't add up. My laptop crashed the next night. My neighbor told me his Wi-Fi had been acting strange. Flickering lights, weird static. I didn't tell anyone about the car or the man in the black suit. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't forget the way he looked at me from the street, the way the flashlight caught the telescope lens like he wanted me to see it. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I see a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the roof, like someone is watching but staying out of sight. And the stars, they don't feel like home anymore. I was out at the burned field before dawn, trying to get a head start on the morning patrol. The fire from a week ago had left that patch of land a mess. Charred, blackened dirt with brittle stalks poking out like broken bones. The whole place still smelled faintly of smoke, even though the rain last night had tried to wash it away. The fog was thick that morning, so thick I could barely see past 20 feet. It was one of those silvery, damp mornings where everything feels muffled. I like those mornings sometimes. Quiet, no distractions. I was standing by the edge of the field, scanning the perimeter with my binoculars, just making sure nothing was smoldering or about to flare up again. We get called in pretty often for that. The fire might be out, but the ground stays hot in spots, and sometimes the wind picks up embers. That's when I noticed it. At first, it looked like nothing. Just a shadow moving above the field. It wasn't moving like a bird or a plane. It was just there. I blinked, and the shadow took shape, a triangular form, dark against the pale gray fog, hovering maybe 30 feet off the ground. It wasn't making a sound, no engine noise, no wind rush, just hanging in the mist like it belonged there. I froze for a minute, trying to convince myself it was some kind of weather balloon or a drone. But nothing about it made sense. No blinking lights, no propellers or wings. Then it moved. Slowly at first, just shifting sideways over the burnt field. Then it disappeared as silently and suddenly as it had appeared, like it melted back into the fog. I was standing there, dumbfounded for a while. The fog started to thin as the sun rose, and the field looked the same as always, charred and quiet. I kept telling myself I must have imagined it. Morning haze, playing tricks. But the feeling in my gut said otherwise. Later that afternoon, back at the firehouse, I was still rattled. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a coffee and flipping through some reports when the door opened, and in walked a man. He was wearing a black suit, no tie, perfectly pressed shirt, shoes that looked polished even though this was a dusty place. His hair was dark, slicked back, and his face was sharp but kind of empty, like he was studying me without actually seeing me. "Afternoon," he said, voice calm but low. He didn't introduce himself or say why he was there. I was about to ask when he walked over to the window, looked out toward the burned field, then without moving toward it, he leaned in like he was inspecting something. He didn't touch anything, but he looked carefully at the scorch marks on the ground visible from the firehouse's vantage point. Then he turned back to me. "We appreciate your discretion," he said, his eyes locking with mine. I wanted to ask who he was, why he was here, but something about his presence made it hard to speak. I just nodded. He stayed another few minutes, looking around the room as if seeing everything for the first time. Then, without another word, he left. After he was gone, I kept thinking about that triangular shape in the fog and the way this guy had appeared out of nowhere and then vanished, just as quietly. I haven't told many people. It felt like something that shouldn't be talked about. Maybe I was being watched, after all. Since then, I avoid that field when the fog rolls in, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear a low hum, like something just beyond the edge of hearing. I don't know what I saw, and I don't know who that man was, but I'm sure it wasn't just a coincidence.